The fluorescent lights hummed in the basement archive of the British Museum. It was 2019, and Dr. Irving Finkel sat at a wooden desk, his fingers tracing symbols on a clay tablet that had been catalogued and forgotten since 1932. The tablet was small, unremarkable, covered in cuneiform script that had waited nearly 90 years for someone to translate it. When he finally decoded the ancient Mesopotamian text, his hands began to shake. The tablet wasn't a record of taxes or temple offerings. It was a prescription, a detailed medical formula for treating infected wounds, written 4,000 years ago. The ingredients were specific: crushed myrtle leaves, cypress resin, and fermented grain mixed in exact proportions. But what stopped Finkel cold wasn't the age of the recipe. It was what modern biochemists confirmed when they tested it 6 months later. The ancient formula killed MRSA methicillin, resistant Staphylococcus aureus, the antibiotic-resistant superbug that kills tens of thousands every year in hospitals across the world. A bacteria that modern medicine struggles to control was being neutralized by a treatment older than the pyramids. The Mesopotamians had no understanding of germ theory. They could see bacteria. They didn't know what infection meant in the way we do. Yet somehow they knew this combination worked. The laboratory results were published quietly in a microbiology journal. Most of the medical establishment ignored it. After all, it seemed impossible. Random chance, perhaps. A lucky guess by ancient people mixing plants. But Finkel could stop thinking about one detail in the cuneiform text. The prescription included warnings about dosage, instructions for preparation temperature, and notes about which patients should avoid the treatment. This wasn't guesswork, this was knowledge. He began pulling other tablets from storage. What he found kept him awake for weeks. Surgical procedures described with precision, pain management protocols, treatments for what we now recognize as diabetes, heart conditions, neurological disorders. All written in clay, preserved by accident when ancient libraries burned, hardening the tablets instead of destroying them. Most had never been translated. They sat in museum basements around the world, catalogued as receipts or letters, their true contents unknown. The question formed slowly in Finkel's mind: then would tea leave? If this one formula worked, what about the others? How many cures were sitting in storage, mistaken for mundane artifacts? And more disturbing, if ancient civilizations possessed medical knowledge this sophisticated, why don't we have it today? The answers he found weren't comforting. Libraries destroyed by conquest, texts burned during religious purges, knowledge suppressed when it conflicted with institutional authority. The Library of Alexandria, the monasteries of medieval Europe, the healing temples of pre-Columbian America. Again and again throughout history, medical knowledge vanished, sometimes by accident, sometimes deliberately. We retold that medicine progresses in a straight line, that we know more now than ever before, that ancient people were primitive, superstitious, their treatments nothing more than folk remedies with no real power. But sitting in that basement, looking at a 4,000-year-old cure for a modern plague, Finkel realized something unsettling. What if modern medicine isn't the peak of human knowledge? What if it is just rediscovery? What if we not advancing but remembering? The tablet went back into storage. The research paper was published and largely forgotten. But the question remained, growing larger in the silence. What else did they know? What else did we lose? And perhaps most importantly, what else are we still forgetting? This wasn't an isolated case. When archaeologists opened a burial site in Peru in 1992, they found something that shouldn't exist. A skull, dated to 400 BCE, showed clear evidence of trepanation, a hole deliberately drilled into the cranium. The bone around the opening had healed completely, smooth and regrown. The patient had lived for years after someone opened their skull with stone tools. This alone would be remarkable. But it wasn't unique. The same procedure appears in ancient Egypt, in China, in Greece, across the Pacific in Mesoamerica. Civilizations separated by oceans and centuries, with no contact, no shared language, no way to exchange knowledge. Yet they all performed the same surgery, and their patients survived at rates that modern neurosurgeons find difficult to believe. Some studies suggest survival rates exceeding 70%, comparable to operations done today with titanium instruments, antibiotics, and sterile operating theaters. The pattern extends beyond surgery. In 1980, medical researchers analyzing bone tissue from ancient Nubian mummies found something impossible: tetracycline, a powerful antibiotic that wasn't discovered by modern science until 1945. The antibiotic was embedded deep in the bone structure, meaning these people had consumed it regularly throughout their lives. The source was eventually traced to their beer, brewed from grain deliberately contaminated with specific strains of Streptomyces bacteria, the same bacteria we use today to manufacture tetracycline. The Nubians were dosing their entire population with antibiotics through daily consumption. Between 350 and 550 CE, they had essentially created a public health system that prevented bacterial infections before they started. No microscopes, no germ theory, no understanding of bacteria. Yet somehow they knew. Then there is the question of pain. Ancient Egyptian papyri describe surgical procedures performed without the patient screaming or thrashing. Chinese texts from 200 CA detail operations where patients remained conscious but felt nothing. Greek physicians wrote about preparations that allowed them to cut deep into the body while the patient slept peacefully. These weren't vague descriptions. They included recipes, specific plants combined in exact proportions, dosages calculated by body weight, instructions for preparation. Modern pharmacologists have tested some of these formulas. Many work exactly as described. Some contain compounds we now recognize as powerful analgesics and sedatives. Others combine plants in ways that create synergistic effects, where the mixture is more potent than any individual ingredient. The ancient doctors didn't understand chemistry, but they understood results. The timeline is what makes this truly disturbing. Between 3000 BC and roughly 500 CE, human medical knowledge appears to have been at a peak, not climbing toward understanding, but already there. Surgeries, pharmaceuticals, diagnostics, public health systems, all functioning at levels that wouldn't be seen again for more than 1,000 years. Then something happened. The Library of Alexandria burned, taking 400,000 scrolls with it. The Nalanda University in India, housing 800 years of medical texts, was destroyed. Spanish conquistadors burned Mayan codices that contained botanical encyclopedias. The Inquisition targeted healers and their books as heretical. War after war scattered populations, killing the knowledge holders, destroying the schools where medical wisdom was taught. By the time Europe emerged from the medieval period, physicians were using leeches and bloodletting, convinced that diseases came from bad air and imbalanced humors. Surgery was performed by barbers. Pain management meant getting drunk or biting leather. The sophisticated medical knowledge that had existed for 3,000 years was gone. We call them the Dark Ages because art and literature declined, but perhaps the real darkness was medical. Perhaps what we lost wasn't just culture, it was the ability to heal. And perhaps that loss was so complete that we don't even realize how much we've forgotten. So what happened? How did knowledge this valuable simply disappear? The Library of Alexandria is famous for what we lost. The plays, the philosophies, the maps of a world we'll never see. But most people don't know about the House of Life. It stood in the medical quarter of the library complex, a separate wing where physicians trained and medical scrolls were stored. When fire consumed the library around 48 BCE, this wing burned with it. 40,000 medical formulas turned to ash in a single night. Surgical manuals accumulated over centuries, pharmaceutical catalogues listing plants and their preparations, diagnostic texts teaching doctors how to identify diseases by pulse, breath, and skin tone. Treatment protocols for ailments that modern medicine still struggles with. All gone. The smoke rising from Alexandria carried away knowledge that had taken civilizations thousands of years to compile. But Alexandria was just the beginning. In 1193, the Nalanda University in India burned for 3 months. The library was so vast, containing so many manuscripts, that the fires could be extinguished. They simply had to burn themselves out. 800 years of Ayurvedic medical texts disappeared in those flames. Recipes for treating infections, reducing inflammation, managing chronic pain, surgical techniques refined through generations of practice, documentation of thousands of medicinal plants, their properties, their interactions, their proper dosages. Students watched from a distance as their teachers' life work turned to smoke. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in the Americas in the 1500s, they found civilizations with extensive botanical knowledge. The Mayans and Aztecs had compiled detailed catalogues of medicinal plants, which species treated fevers, which healed wounds, which could be used as anesthetics during surgery. Bishop Diego de Landa ordered these codices burned as works of the devil. Thousands of texts, representing centuries of accumulated medical wisdom, were destroyed in public ceremonies. Only 4 Mayan codices survived. 4 out of thousands. The Inquisition went further. Between 1400 and 1700, medical texts were specifically targeted as heretical if they came from non-Christian sources or were written by women. Female healers posed a particular threat. Their success with herbal treatments and midwifery challenged the authority of university-trained male physicians. When these women were tried as witches, their books burned with them. Treatment protocols passed mother to daughter for generations were lost in an afternoon. Some historians argue these were unfortunate casualties of war and religious conflict, collateral damage. But the pattern suggests something darker. Medieval rulers issued edicts specifically banning certain medical texts, books that taught common people how to treat themselves without expensive physicians. In 1322, a French ordinance made it illegal for anyone outside the medical guild to practice healing or possess medical texts. Similar laws appeared across Europe. Medical knowledge became a monopoly. Those who controlled access to healing controlled populations. A population that could heal itself was harder to govern, harder to extract wealth from, harder to keep dependent. Better to let the knowledge burn and ensure people needed official doctors, official medicines, official approval to stay alive. By the time the medieval period ended, an estimated 90% of ancient medical texts had vanished. What remains are fragments, partial formulas with missing ingredients, surgical descriptions without the crucial details, references to treatments we can quite reconstruct. We weave inherited puzzle pieces of a picture we can barely imagine, glimpses of medical sophistication that took thousands of years to build and mere centuries to destroy. The question is, just what we lost. It is what that loss cost us. How many people died from diseases that ancient doctors could have treated? How much suffering could have been prevented if the knowledge had survived? But not everything burned. Some healers hid their knowledge, some texts were buried, sealed in tombs, or copied in secret. And when archaeologists finally found them, what they discovered challenged everything we thought we knew about ancient medicine. In 1862, a German Egyptologist named Georg Ebers purchased a papyrus scroll from a dealer in Luxor. When he unrolled it, he found himself looking at 20 meters of densely written hieratic script, one of the longest ancient texts ever discovered. The scroll dated to 1550 BCE, making it over 3,500 years old. It contained 777 medical formulas, ritual incantations, and treatment protocols for everything from infected wounds to digestive disorders. The academic world initially dismissed many entries as superstition, spells to drive out demons, magical words to cure disease, recipes mixing medicinal plants with bizarre ingredients like pig, ear and crocodile dung. It looked like exactly what you'd expect from an ancient civilization that didn't understand science. desperation disguised as medicine. Then researchers started testing the formulas. The first shock came from a burn treatment. The papyrus prescribed honey mixed with tree resin, applied directly to burned skin. Modern medical testing revealed that this combination has antimicrobial properties superior to some contemporary burn treatments. The honey creates a moisture barrier, while the resin contains compounds that prevent bacterial growth. Hospitals in several countries now use medical-grade honey for burn victims, particularly those with antibiotic-resistant infections. A 3,000-year-old remedy solving a 21st century problem. The second validation was stranger. One formula described a contraceptive using acacia leaves ground into powder and mixed with honey. When biochemists analyzed this combination, they found it produces lactic acid, a natural spermicide. The ancient Egyptians had created an effective contraceptive without understanding reproduction, cellular biology, or chemistry. They simply observed that women using this preparation didn't become pregnant. The third example was the most unsettling. A treatment for what the papyrus called eating ulcers. Growths that consumed healthy flesh used a paste made from dates, pig's ear, and specific mineral powders. Modern analysis identified compounds in this mixture with legitimate anti-tumor properties. Whether it actually treated cancer is debatable, but the ingredients weren't random. Someone, somewhere, noticed that this combination affected abnormal growths. The pattern becomes clear across all 700 formulas. The Egyptians didn't understand why treatments worked. They had no concept of infection, no knowledge of bacteria, no theory of disease. What they had was time, thousands of years of observation, experimentation, and documentation. They tried combinations, noted results, refined recipes, and passed successful treatments to the next generation. It was empirical medicine, pre-theoretical but effective. The organizational structure of the papyrus rivals modern medical texts. Diseases are categorized by body system. Symptoms are described with clinical precision. Dosages are specified, not vague amounts, but exact measurements. Treatment duration is noted. Side effects are warned against. Some entries include information about which patients should avoid certain remedies. This wasn't folk wisdom scribbled on a scroll. This was systematic medical practice. What makes the Ebers papyrus even more remarkable is what it represents. The scroll itself states clearly that it copied from older sources, medical texts that, even in 1550 BCE, were considered ancient. Researchers estimate these source documents dated back to at least 2500 BCE. Possibly earlier. The medical knowledge in the papyrus wasn't new when it was written. It was already over 1,000 years old. That means Egyptian medical wisdom stretched back at least 4,500 years. 45 centuries of accumulated knowledge, refined through generations of healers who documented what worked and discarded what didn't. The Ebers papyrus is just a snapshot of a medical tradition that was old when the pyramids were young, and it is one of the few survivors. Most Egyptian medical texts are gone, burned in Alexandria, lost to decay, destroyed by conquest. What remains are fragments like this, glimpses of a sophisticated medical system that knew how to heal without knowing why. But while Egypt was writing the Ebers papyrus, another civilization on the opposite side of the world was compiling medical knowledge that would dwarf even Alexandria's library. A tradition so vast, so detailed, that pieces of it are still being discovered today. The Huangdi Neijing, the Yellow Emperor's inner canon, was compiled around 200 BCE, but the knowledge it contains is far older. The text itself references medical practices and observations accumulated over 2,000 years. Unlike the Egyptian papyri with their lists of remedies and incantations, this document presented something different, a complete philosophy of the human body, a systematic theory of how health works, how disease develops, and how balance can be restored. The text describes the body as an interconnected system where energy flows through specific pathways called meridians. 12 major channels and 8 extraordinary vessels carrying qi, life force, to every organ and tissue. For centuries, Western medicine dismissed this as poetic metaphor at best, fantasy at worst. Energy flowed through invisible channels. There was no anatomical evidence, no physical structures corresponding to these supposed pathways. Then researchers started measuring. Modern bioelectrical studies have detected measurable electrical patterns along the traditional meridian lines. The conductivity of skin at acupuncture points differs from surrounding tissue. MRE scans show that stimulating specific points triggers activity in corresponding areas of the brain and body, often far from the needle insertion site. The meridians may not be physical channels like blood vessels, but something is happening along those exact pathways the ancient Chinese mapped. The Huangdi Neijing taught pulse diagnosis, a skill that took 12 years to master. Physicians learned to detect 28 different pulse qualities at 6 positions on the wrist, each revealing the state of specific organs. They could identify pregnancy within weeks of conception, detect internal bleeding, recognize infections before fever appeared, diagnose organ dysfunction that wouldn't show symptoms for months. Western doctors called this impossible. Then studies in Chinese medical universities tested practitioners in blind conditions. Many successfully diagnosed conditions that blood tests and imaging later confirmed. The accuracy wasn't perfect, but it was statistically significant. Something real was being detected through fingertips pressed against wrist arteries. The text describes acupuncture in language that sounds mystical, balancing yin and yang, redirecting blocked qi, harmonizing organ systems. But strip away the terminology, and you are left with something that looks remarkably like neurology. The deliberate stimulation of nerve pathways to modulate pain signals, reduce inflammation, and trigger immune responses. The 365 acupuncture points mapped in the Huangdi Neijing correspond almost exactly to areas of high neurological activity. Modern pain management clinics now use acupuncture because MRI studies show it activating the same brain regions as pharmaceutical painkillers. The most stunning sections describe surgical procedures, organ transplants, cardiovascular repairs, techniques that historians insisted were theoretically impossible without modern tools and knowledge. Were these actual practices or thought experiments? We may never know, but the descriptions are specific enough that modern surgeons recognize legitimate anatomical understanding. Then there is Hua Tuo, a surgeon who lived around 200 CE, centuries after the Huangdi Neijing was compiled. Historical records describe him performing abdominal surgeries while patients remained conscious but pain-free. His anesthetic was called Maphisen, a mixture of wine and specific herbs. The exact formula is lost, but contemporary accounts are consistent. He opened bodies, removed tumors, repaired organs, and sewed patients closed. They survived, they recovered, they lived for years afterward. We have no idea what was in Maphisen. Dozens of researchers have tried to recreate it based on fragmentary descriptions. None have succeeded. That formula, capable of providing surgical anesthesia using only plants and alcohol, disappeared sometime during the medieval period. Another piece of medical knowledge that worked was documented and then vanished. What makes Chinese medicine particularly significant is that it developed completely independently. No contact with Egypt, no exchange with Greece or Rome, yet they arrived at similar conclusions. That disease has patterns, that the body can heal itself if given proper support. That observation and documentation over generations reveals truths about health that individual practitioners could never discover alone. Egypt gave us formulas. China gave us philosophy. But there was one ancient text that combined both detailed recipes with systematic theory, practical surgery with spiritual understanding, and it nearly vanished from history entirely. Around 600 BCE, an Indian physician named Sushruta compiled a medical text that would become one of the most comprehensive surgical manuals in human history. The Sushruta Samhita described over 300 surgical procedures using 120 different instruments. cataract removal, dental extractions, cesarean sections, kidney stone operations, and something that shouldn't have been possible, reconstructive plastic surgery. The text includes detailed instructions for rhinoplasty, nose reconstruction using a flap of skin from the forehead, carefully measured and rotated to create a new nose. The technique is described step by step, the angle of the cut, the method of attachment, the aftercare to prevent infection. Modern plastic surgeons didn't standardize this procedure until the early 1900s. They called it innovative. But Sushruta had documented it 2,600 years earlier. What makes this even more remarkable is that nose amputation was a common judicial punishment in ancient India. Criminals and adulterers had their noses cut off as public shame. Sushruta developed rhinoplasty, not as cosmetic vanity, but as reconstructive necessity, giving mutilated people their faces back. The surgery worked, patients healed. The technique spread through generations of surgeons until it was eventually lost, then rediscovered in the West centuries later as if it were new. The Sushruta Samhita understood something that European medicine wouldn't grasp for over 2,000 years. Cleanliness prevents infection. The text prescribes sterilizing instruments by heating them in fire and fumigating them with specific smoke. Essentially antiseptic technique practiced routinely in 600 BC India. Joseph Lister would pioneer antiseptic surgery in Europe until 1867. The Indians were already doing it when Rome was still a village. Sushruta's training program for surgeons was methodical and unforgiving. Students didn't begin with patients. They practiced incisions on vegetables, learning how much pressure to apply, how steady the hand must be. They practiced suturing on leather and cloth, then graduated to dead animal tissue. Only after years of practice on non-living materials were they permitted to touch a living patient. This graduated training system is essentially what modern medical schools use today. Practice on simulators, then cadavers, then supervised surgery on actual patients. The text describes a technique so ingenious that modern emergency medicine has rediscovered it with amazement. For abdominal wounds that needed closing quickly, Sushruta prescribed using large ants. The ant would be held so its powerful jaws bit through both sides of the wound, clamping them together. Then the body would be severed, leaving the head attached as a natural suture. The jaws remained locked after death, holding the wound closed while it healed. Modern wilderness medicine recognizes this as brilliant improvisation for resource-limited settings. Beyond surgery, the Sushruta Samhita catalogues hundreds of medicinal plants, mineral preparations, dietary protocols for post-surgical recovery, instructions for managing pain, preventing infection, supporting healing. This wasn't theoretical knowledge. These were procedures performed successfully enough times that they could be standardized, taught, and documented for future generations. The level of empirical experimentation required to develop this knowledge is staggering. How many failed surgeries before the rhinoplasty technique was perfected? How many observations before the right plants for infection were identified? How many patients before the training program was refined? The Sushruta Samhita represents centuries, perhaps millennia, of accumulated surgical wisdom. 3 continents, 3 completely different medical traditions. Yet Egypt, China, and India all arrived at sophisticated medical knowledge through careful observation and documentation. These texts survived because someone recognized their value, someone protected them, someone copied them through generations. But they are the exceptions. Most ancient medical knowledge wasn't so lucky. What we've seen so far, the formulas, the philosophies, the surgical techniques, these are fragments, the survivors. The real story is what disappeared, and that story is far darker than we've yet explored. The skull from the burial site showed clear evidence of trepanation. A hole the size of a coin had been drilled through the cranium using a stone tool. The bone around the edges had healed smoothly, meaning the patient lived for months or years after someone opened their head with technology barely more advanced than a sharp rock. But here is what keeps archaeologists awake at night. There are no bite marks on the body. No signs the patient was restrained. No indication they were held down by force while someone drilled into their skull, which means somehow impossibly this ancient surgery was performed without the patient fighting, screaming, or dying from shock. The ancient world had painkillers, effective ones. So effective that when the formulas were lost, 19th century surgeons called it the greatest tragedy in medical history. An Assyrian inscription from 700 BCE describes what it calls the royal jar, a preparation that removes all sensation from the flesh. The formula is partially preserved opium poppy for its sedative properties, mandrake root for its hallucinogenic and pain-numbing effects, and 3 other plants whose names are written in a script scholars still can definitively translate. Researchers have tried dozens of combinations attempting to recreate it. None have succeeded. The missing ingredients remain a mystery. The Ebers papyrus mentions a sleeping potion used before surgery. The formula combined hemp, wine, and specific plant alkaloids in precise quantities. Modern pharmacologists examining the partial recipe identified a critical feature. The combination would produce deep unconsciousness without suppressing breathing. Respiratory depression is one of the most dangerous aspects of modern anesthesia. Patients stop breathing and die if not carefully monitored. The Egyptian formula somehow avoided this, but key ingredients are listed using plant names that correspond to species now extinct or impossible to identify with certainty. Greek medical texts reference surgeries performed in the temple of Asclepius, the god of healing. Patients would enter the temple, undergo a ritual preparation, and experience what texts describe as divine sleep. They would wake hours later with procedures completed, bones set, tumors removed, stones extracted, with minimal pain and clear memories of peaceful dreams. These weren't miracles. They were medical procedures using sedatives so potent and controlled that patients remained unconscious throughout surgery, but woke without trauma. The formulas were temple secrets, passed from priest, physician to apprentice through oral tradition. Written records were deliberately vague, protecting the knowledge from outsiders. When the temples were eventually closed by Christian emperors, the formulas died with the last priests who knew them. By the time modern surgery emerged in the 1800s, effective anesthesia had been forgotten. Early surgeons used ether and chloroform, chemicals that worked but killed patients at alarming rates. Ether was explosive and caused severe nausea. Chloroform stopped hearts. Mortality rates for anesthetized surgery were high enough that many patients chose to endure procedures conscious rather than risk the anesthesia. Medical journals from that era contain striking passages, surgeons lamenting that ancient methods were superior, references to Roman surgical texts describing pain, free amputations, wistful mentions of Egyptian formulas that supposedly worked without the dangers of modern chemicals. These weren't nostalgic fantasies. These were trained physicians recognizing that somewhere in history, the problem of surgical pain had been solved better than they could solve it. Why did these formulas vanish? Specialization played a role. Only certain healers knew the complete recipes. Knowledge concentrated in small groups, temple priests, royal physicians, specialized herbalists. When those groups were eliminated through persecution, conquest, or institutional change, their knowledge died with them. Oral tradition was another vulnerability. Many cultures deliberately didn't write down their most powerful medical formulas, fearing the knowledge would be stolen or misused. This protected the information temporarily, but made it fragile. One broken generation and the wisdom was gone forever. And there is a darker possibility. Herbal pain relief threatened emerging institutional medicine. If common healers could provide effective anesthesia using plants, patients didn't need expensive university-trained physicians. Better to suppress the competition, restrict who could legally practice medicine, and let the formulas be forgotten. Modern pharmaceutical companies now study residues in ancient surgical tools and medicine vessels, using mass spectrometry to identify compounds. They're trying to engineer formulas from molecular traces left on bronze scalpels and clay jars. Sometimes they find fragments, hints, never the complete answer. But pain wasn't the only thing ancient healers could control. In 1980, a team of anthropologists analyzing bone tissue from ancient Nubian remains found something impossible: tetracycline, a powerful broad-spectrum antibiotic that wasn't discovered by modern science until 1945. The antibiotic wasn't on the surface of the bones. It was embedded deep in the tissue structure, integrated into the bone itself during life. The first assumption was contamination, modern antibiotics somehow seeping into ancient remains through soil or groundwater. But further testing eliminated that possibility. The tetracycline concentration patterns matched what you see in living people who consumed the antibiotic regularly over years. These people, who lived between 350 and 550 ca in what is now Sudan, were taking antibiotics. The question was how. The answer turned out to be beer. The Nubians brewed beer from grain stored in mud, brick granaries. The grain became contaminated with soil bacteria, specifically Streptomyces, the same bacterial genus modern pharmaceutical companies use to produce tetracycline. When the contaminated grain was fermented into beer, the bacteria produced tetracycline as a natural byproduct. Everyone drank beer, adults, children, daily, which meant the entire population was receiving regular antibiotic doses through their most common beverage. Whether this was intentional or accidental remains debated, but the Nubians had unusually low rates of bone infection compared to neighboring populations. Their children showed less evidence of childhood diseases. Their overall health, as far as skeletal remains can indicate, was remarkably good for the ancient world. They were healthier because they were taking antibiotics 700 years before Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin, and they weren't alone. The Ebers papyrus describes applying moldy bread to infected wounds. Egyptian physicians specifically noted that certain types of mold were more effective than others. They weren't just using any spoiled bread. They were selective about which fungal growth they applied. We now know that certain bread molds produce penicillin. The Egyptians were using it without understanding why it worked. Chinese medical texts from the Han Dynasty mention using fermented soybean curd on skin infections. Modern analysis of traditional fermented soybean products shows they contain bacteria that produce natural antibiotics. Greek physicians wrote about collecting specific soils from particular locations and applying them to wounds. Those soils contained high concentrations of antibiotic, producing microorganisms. These weren't superstitions. They were treatments that worked. Healers observed that infected wounds treated with moldy bread healed better than untreated wounds. That specific soils prevented infections from worsening. That certain fermented foods fought disease. They didn't know about bacteria or antibiotics or microbial warfare, but they knew results. Then the germ theory revolution arrived in the 1800s. Medicine became scientific. Treatments needed mechanisms, explanations, theories. Old practices that worked through unknown means were dismissed as folk remedies. Superstition, old wives' tales. The professionalization of medicine actively discouraged traditional practices that could be explained through contemporary scientific understanding. By the time Fleming noticed that mold contamination in his Petri dish killed bacteria, the ancient knowledge was gone. He is credited with discovering penicillin, but he rediscovered it. The Egyptians knew, the Greeks knew, the Chinese knew. They just could explain it in terms that modern science would accept, so their knowledge was erased. The irony is brutal. We are now facing antibiotic-resistant superbugs that modern medicine struggles to control. Musavir, carbapenem-resistant bacteria. Our most powerful antibiotics are failing. Patients die from infections that were easily treatable 20 years ago. Yet ancient texts describe treatments for persistent infections that would not yield to other remedies. What were they using? What did they know? Modern researchers are beginning to look backward. Microbiologists are studying ancient garbage heaps, middens where organic waste accumulated over centuries. They refinding previously unknown antibiotic, producing microorganisms. bacteria and fungi that generate compounds pharmaceutical companies have never isolated. Some of these organisms appear to have been concentrated in areas near ancient settlements, suggesting they might have been deliberately cultivated or at least recognized and encouraged. The ancient healers could see bacteria, but they could see infection. They could observe what helped and what didn't. Over centuries, they built a practical understanding of antibiotic therapy without the theory to explain it. Then we lost it, dismissed it, forgot it. Now, as our antibiotics fail and drug-resistant infections spread, we re-digging through ancient garbage looking for answers. But infections weren't the only battle ancient medicine won. Cancer isn't a modern disease. We like to think it is. Blame it on pollution, processed food, industrial chemicals. But paleopathologists have found cancerous tumors in Egyptian mummies, in Peruvian remains buried 2,000 years ago, in dinosaur bones from the Jurassic period. Cancer is ancient. Humans have always had it, and ancient physicians knew it when they saw it. The Ebers Papyrus describes what it calls eating ulcers, growths that consume healthy flesh, spreading outward, resistant to normal wound treatment. The description matches skin cancer. The papyrus doesn't just identify the disease, it prescribes treatment. A paste made from dates, pig brain, and a green mineral pigment ground into powder. Apply it directly to the ulcer. Reapply daily until the growth stops spreading. Modern analysis of that green pigment revealed it contained copper compounds. Copper has known anti-tumor properties. It disrupts cancer cell metabolism. Some modern topical chemotherapy treatments use copper-based compounds for exactly the same purpose the Egyptians did, burning away surface lesions. They didn't understand cellular biology or DNA mutation, but they observed that this specific combination stopped certain growths from spreading. The Sushruta Samhita describes surgical removal of tumors. The text distinguishes between growths that should be cut out and those that shouldn't be touched. It notes that some masses, when removed, return worse than before. Modern oncology knows this phenomenon. Some tumors metastasize more aggressively after incomplete surgical removal. Sushruta was documenting the same observation 2,600 years ago. Chinese medical texts mention hard accumulations in organs, masses that cause pain, weight loss, and eventually death. The treatments prescribed include herbal compounds and mineral preparations. One specific remedy used arsenic in carefully controlled doses. Western medicine dismissed this as poisonous quackery until the 1990s, when researchers discovered that arsenic trioxide effectively treats acute promyelocytic leukemia. It is now an FDA-approved chemotherapy drug. The Chinese were using it for abnormal growths 2,000 years before modern oncology proved it worked. Greek physicians, particularly those following Hippocratic tradition, wrote about using dietary restriction to starve tumors. Patients with wasting diseases and growths were put on specific diets, low in certain foods, high in others. This sounds like ancient mysticism until you learn about modern metabolic approaches to cancer treatment. Some cancers are highly dependent on glucose. Restricting carbohydrates can slow their growth. The Greeks could measure blood sugar or tumor metabolism, but they documented that dietary changes affected disease progression. Did ancient medicine cure cancer? Not consistently, not reliably. Cancer remains one of medicine's greatest challenges even today. But ancient physicians had strategies. They observed what worked, even partially. They documented approaches that sometimes helped. They recognized that different growths responded to different treatments. The question isn't whether they could cure all cancers. It is why we aren't systematically studying what they did try. Modern oncology essentially started from scratch in the 20th century. We developed chemotherapy, radiation, immunotherapy through modern research. But we largely ignored 5,000 years of human observation about treatments that affected tumor growth. Recent research is changing that. Studies on traditional Chinese herbal formulas have found compounds with legitimate anti-cancer properties. Curcumin from turmeric, berberine from various plants, compounds from mushrooms used in ancient medicine. Some are now in clinical trials. Pharmaceutical companies are mining traditional medicine databases for leads. Ancient medical texts may contain clues they overlooked, not miracle cures, not magic bullets, but observations worth investigating, combinations worth testing, approaches worth understanding. We've seen treatments for pain, infection, even cancer. But ancient medicine didn't just fight disease after it appeared. The real sophistication was in prevention. The healers of the past understood something modern medicine forgot. The best cure is the one you never need. The temple at Heliopolis rose from the desert like a stone mountain. Inside its walls, beyond the public courtyards where worshippers brought offerings, existed a place few outsiders ever saw. The Per-Ankh, the house of life, part hospital, part medical school, part pharmaceutical laboratory. This was where Egyptian medicine lived and breathed. Egyptian physicians weren't just healers. They were priests. Medicine was sacred knowledge, protected and transmitted through religious institutions. The temples weren't only places of worship. They were centers of medical practice where patients came for treatment, students came for training, and the accumulated wisdom of generations was carefully guarded. The Greek historian Herodotus visited Egypt around 450 BCE and wrote with astonishment about what he found. Egyptian medicine was specialized. One physician treated eyes, another treated teeth, another focused on internal diseases, another specialized in what we now call surgery. This wasn't the general practitioner model familiar to most ancient cultures. This was organized, systematic specialization, each physician becoming an expert in their specific domain through years of focused study. The training was rigorous. Medical students entered the House of Life as young men and studied for 6 to 10 years before practicing independently. They learned anatomy through the mummification process, watching embalmers remove organs, observing the body's internal structure, understanding how the parts connected. They learned pharmacology in temple gardens where medicinal plants were deliberately cultivated, studying which leaves, roots, and seeds had healing properties. They learned diagnostics through supervised patient care, watching master physicians examine symptoms, ask questions, and make treatment decisions. But not everything was written down. The papyri we found, the Ebers, the Edwin Smith, the Cahoon, contain hundreds of formulas and procedures. Yet ancient texts reference treatments that aren't described anywhere in surviving documents. The remedy of the gods for blindness, mentioned multiple times, never explained. The royal cure for paralysis, referenced in administrative records when a pharaoh paid physicians to treat a foreign dignitary. The formula isn't recorded. The breath of life for respiratory failure. We know it existed because medical accounts describe patients recovering from conditions that should have been fatal. We have no idea what it contained. These weren't oversights. The most powerful remedies were kept secret deliberately, passed from master to apprentice through oral tradition. A physician would teach their most advanced student in private, speaking the formula aloud, demonstrating the preparation, ensuring the knowledge continued to the next generation, but only to worthy students, only to those who proved themselves, only within the priesthood. This system protected medical knowledge from being misused. It maintained the authority and prestige of the physician, priests, and it made the knowledge incredibly fragile. If a master died before passing certain formulas to an apprentice, that knowledge died too. If a temple was destroyed and its priesthood scattered, generations of accumulated wisdom could vanish in a single violent afternoon. Archaeological evidence hints at medical capabilities beyond what the papyri describe. Surgical instruments have been found, bronze tools with specialized shapes and purposes that don't match any procedure in surviving texts. There are forceps designed for operations we can't identify. Probes meant for accessing body cavities in ways no documented surgery describes. Cutting implements with edges shaped for techniques we don't understand. What were these tools used for? What procedures did Egyptian surgeons perform that weren't written down? We find evidence of healed surgical wounds in mummies, operations that succeeded, patients who survived and lived for years afterward. Yet the papyri don't describe those specific surgeries. The knowledge was there, the capability existed, but the information wasn't recorded. Greek kings knew the value of Egyptian medical knowledge. They paid fortunes to bring Egyptian physicians to their courts. Alexander the Great employed them. The Ptolemaic dynasty that ruled Egypt after Alexander's death continued the tradition, ensuring royal access to the best medical care Egypt could provide. But even they couldn't access the deepest secrets. Even they couldn't learn what the physician-priests chose not to teach. The House of Life eventually closed, the temples fell. The physician-priests disappeared, and with them went knowledge that no papyrus preserved, formulas spoken but never written, techniques demonstrated but never documented, wisdom that lived in human memory and died when that memory ended. But the Egyptians weren't just treaters of disease. They were masters of something even more sophisticated than curing illness. They understood prevention. An Egyptian worker woke before sunrise. The first thing they did wasn't pray or eat. It was bathe. Water from a clay jar poured over the body. Natron, a naturally occurring mineral compound, rubbed into the skin as soap. The chemical composition of natron is sodium carbonate mixed with sodium bicarbonate. Modern science recognizes it as an effective antibacterial agent. The Egyptians just knew that people who bathed with it stayed healthier. They bathed again at midday, again in the evening. This wasn't religious ritual or luxury reserved for the wealthy. This was public health practice that everyone followed, rich and poor. Workers and priests multiple times daily in a desert climate where water was precious. Egyptians prioritized cleanliness. They shaved their heads, removed body hair, not for aesthetics, for hygiene. Lice were a constant threat in the ancient world. Most civilizations simply accepted infestation as inevitable. Egyptians eliminated the habitat. No hair meant no lice. In summer heat, it also meant better cooling and reduced skin infections from sweat and dirt. Their dental hygiene was remarkably advanced. They used tooth powder made from crushed eggshells for mild abrasion, myrrh for its antimicrobial properties, and pumice for whitening. Examination of Egyptian mummies shows dental health superior to medieval Europeans. 1,000 years later, cavities were less common. Gum disease was rarer. They understood that oral health mattered, that the mouth was a gateway for disease. The Egyptian diet was what modern nutritionists now call Mediterranean. Bread from wheat and barley, beer made from fermented grain, vegetables grown along the Nile, onions, garlic, leeks, lettuce, fish from the river. Meat was eaten sparingly, usually during festivals. This wasn't poverty cuisine, this was deliberate dietary practice. They sweetened food with honey instead of processed sugars. Honey provided antimicrobial benefits beyond its taste. They consumed garlic and onions daily. Modern research shows these plants contain compounds that boost immune function and support cardiovascular health. The Egyptians didn't understand biochemistry, but they observed that populations eating these foods stayed healthier than those who didn't. Even their cosmetics were medicinal. The dramatic eye makeup, kohl painted around the eyes in distinctive lines, was long dismissed as vanity. Then researchers analyzed the compounds. The kohl was made from antimony and galena, ground into powder and mixed with fat. Recent studies show these compounds stimulated the body's production of nitric oxide around the eyes, which strengthened immune response against bacterial infections. The makeup also reduced sun glare in the intense desert light. It was medicine disguised as beauty. Egyptian medical texts contain detailed prenatal care instructions. Pregnant women were advised to eat specific foods, avoid others, and rest at particular intervals. Birthing positions described in the papyri are the same positions modern obstetrics has validated as optimal squatting or kneeling, using gravity to assist delivery rather than the flat-on-back position. Common in recent Western medicine, postpartum care included dietary protocols, rest periods, and herbal preparations to support recovery. They understood disease patterns in ways that wouldn't be called epidemiology for thousands of years. The Nile flooded annually, bringing life-giving water and silt to the fields. But Egyptian physicians noticed that certain illnesses spiked in the weeks after floods. We now know flooding spreads waterborne diseases and increases mosquito populations. The Egyptians didn't know about bacteria or parasites, but they observed the pattern and implemented preventive measures during flood season, water purifications, specific herbal preparations, dietary adjustments. What made Egyptian medicine sophisticated wasn't just their ability to treat disease. It was their understanding that health is maintained through daily practice, that prevention is easier than cure, that the body stays strong when given proper care. Egyptians lived longer, healthier lives than medieval Europeans, not because of better medicine, but because they made medicine part of daily life. Every bath was disease prevention, every meal was pharmaceutical intervention, every routine was health maintenance. Medieval Europe abandoned these practices. Bathing became rare. Dental care disappeared. Preventive thinking was replaced with reactive treatment. Public health collapsed, and diseases that Egyptian civilization had largely controlled ravaged European populations. Egyptian preventive care was daily wisdom. But when diseases struck despite precautions, they had diagnostic systems that let them identify problems modern doctors need machines to detect. The Egyptian physician placed 2 fingers on the patient's wrist, not a quick check of heartbeat like modern doctors do, a long, focused assessment, feeling the rhythm, the strength, the quality of the pulse. Then moving to another position, then another, checking 6 different locations on each arm, each supposedly revealing the state of different internal organs. For centuries, Western medicine dismissed this as nonsense. The pulse is the pulse. It tells you heart rate and rhythm, nothing more. Checking multiple locations is theatrical superstition with no medical value, except recent research has found something unexpected. Arterial stiffness varies by location depending on cardiovascular health. Blood pressure measurements can differ between pulse points when certain organs are failing. The pulse does carry information about more than just the heart. The Egyptians were detecting real diagnostic signals. The Ebers Papyrus describes what it calls questioning of the heart, a complete diagnostic protocol. The physician felt the pulse at multiple points, observed the patient's skin color and texture, examined the whites of the eyes for yellowing or redness, smelled the patient's breath, checked fingernails for color and shape, examined waste products, urine and stool for color, odor, and consistency. This comprehensive assessment provided a detailed picture of the patient's internal state without cutting them open or using any technology. The Egyptians recognized diagnostic correlations that wouldn't be scientifically explained for thousands of years. Yellow skin meant liver problems, what we now call jaundice from bile buildup. Foul-smelling urine indicated infection. Sweet-smelling breath suggested what we'd now recognize as diabetes. Pale, brittle fingernails meant blood disorders. These connections weren't lucky guesses. They were patterns established through centuries of patient observation, documented and taught through generations of physician training. They conceptualized the body as having channels, the Weda system that carried air, blood, and disease throughout the body. Anatomically, this wasn't correct by modern standards. There aren't mystical channels flowing through the body, but the concept showed systematic thinking. The Egyptians understood that the body's parts are interconnected, that problems in one area affect others, that disease spreads through pathways even if they couldn't physically see those pathways. The real mystery is how they diagnosed internal conditions without imaging. A patient comes in complaining of pain, no x-rays, no CT scans, no blood tests. How do you know if it is a kidney stone, a tumor, an infection, or something else entirely? The answer is observation skill developed through decades of training. Egyptian physicians spent years learning to recognize subtle signs. A particular quality of pulse, combined with specific skin color and certain breath odor, meant one condition. A different combination pointed to something else. They built mental databases of patterns, thousands of symptom combinations linked to specific diagnoses. Modern doctors learned similar pattern recognition, but they have technology as backup. Egyptian physicians had only their senses. This skill still exists. Medical literature contains accounts of diagnostic experts, usually older physicians trained before modern imaging became ubiquitous, who can identify conditions through pure clinical examination that technology later confirms. A doctor feeling a patient's abdomen and declaring enlarged spleen that ultrasound verifies. A physician listening to lung sounds and pinpointing pneumonia location that X-rays match exactly. These aren't miracles. They're finely honed observational skills, but they're becoming rare. Modern medical education emphasizes technology. Students learn to order tests rather than trust their hands and eyes. Doctors spend appointments looking at computer screens rather than examining patients. The machines are powerful and often necessary, but something is lost. The intimate knowledge of how disease manifests in the living body, knowledge that Egyptian physicians spent lifetimes developing, is fading from modern practice. An Egyptian physician could diagnose liver disease by checking your pulse and smelling your breath. The modern equivalent requires blood tests, imaging studies, possibly a biopsy. Both approaches have value, but one costs $10,000 and the other required only skill, time, and attention. The Egyptians built medicine as a science, systematic, documented, taught through rigorous training. They approached healing as a battle against disease, a technical challenge to be solved through knowledge and intervention. But thousands of miles away, another civilization was approaching healing from the opposite direction. Not fighting disease, but balancing the body's natural harmony. Not attacking problems, but supporting inherent wellness. A completely different philosophy that would produce completely different medicine. In the mountains of ancient China, Taoist monks watched. They observed how rivers flowed, strong in spring, gentle in summer, dormant in winter. They watched trees lose leaves in autumn and burst with growth in spring. They noticed that animals grew active at dawn, rested at midday, hunted at dusk. Everything moved in cycles. Everything had rhythm. Everything balanced. And they wondered, if nature operates through balance, doesn't the human body follow the same principles? This question became the foundation of an entirely different approach to medicine. While Egyptian physicians fought disease like an enemy to be defeated, Eastern healers saw disease as imbalance to be corrected. The body wasn't a battlefield. It was an ecosystem. Health wasn't victory over illness. It was harmony maintained. They developed concepts that Western medicine would dismiss as mystical nonsense for centuries. Yin and yang, opposing but complementary forces that must remain balanced, cold and heat, rest and activity, contraction and expansion. The 5 elements, wood, fire, earth, metal, water, representing different organ systems, seasons and life phases. Chi life energy flowing through the body along specific pathways called meridians. These ideas sound like philosophy, not medicine, poetic metaphors with no scientific basis. Except modern research keeps finding physical correlates. Circadian rhythms, the body's daily biological cycles that affect everything from hormone production to immune function. That is yin and yang in scientific language, the opposition between day and night, activity and rest, built into our cellular machinery. Homeostasis, the body's constant self-regulation to maintain stable internal conditions, despite external changes. That is the 5 elements philosophy expressed through biochemistry. Different organ systems working together to maintain balance. Bioelectrical signaling, the measurable electrical patterns that coordinate cellular communication throughout the body. That is chi flow, stripped of mysticism and measured with voltmeters. The energy pathways aren't metaphorical, they're detectable. Eastern medicine excelled where Western medicine struggled. Chronic conditions that develop slowly over years, managing health in aging populations, preventing disease progression before symptoms became severe. A Western doctor might say your tests are normal, while a patient feels progressively worse. An Eastern practitioner would detect imbalance years before measurable pathology appeared. The training was as rigorous as any medical school. Traditional Chinese medicine practitioners studied for 10 years or more. They learned thousands of herbs and their interactions, which combinations enhanced effects, which caused dangerous reactions. They mastered pulse diagnosis, detecting 28 different pulse qualities that revealed internal states. They memorized the locations of 365 acupuncture points and understood which points affected which conditions. This wasn't folk wisdom passed down casually. This was specialized knowledge requiring the same dedication modern doctors invest. Why did Eastern and Western medicine develop so differently? Context shaped philosophy. Western medicine emerged from Greek battlefield surgery and Roman epidemic response. Soldiers needed immediate intervention. Set the broken bone, stop the bleeding, remove the arrow. Plagues required dramatic action, quarantine, treatment, crisis management. Western medicine learned to be aggressive, interventionist, focused on acute crisis. Eastern medicine developed in stable agricultural societies where the same families lived in the same villages for generations. The priority wasn't surviving sudden trauma. It was maintaining health through decades, preventing the slow decline of aging, managing chronic conditions that developed over years. Eastern medicine learned patience, subtlety, long-term thinking. Neither approach is superior. They read different tools for different problems. Western medicine saves trauma victims and cures acute infections with effectiveness. Eastern medicine can match. Eastern medicine manages chronic illness and supports healthy aging with approaches Western medicine is only beginning to understand. For most of modern history, Western medicine insisted its approach was the only valid one. Eastern practices were dismissed as primitive superstition. Acupuncture was placebo, herbal medicine was folklore, qi was fantasy. Then research started validating what 5,000 years of practice had already demonstrated. Acupuncture measurably reduces pain and inflammation. Herbal formulas contain pharmacologically active compounds. The diagnostic techniques detect real physiological changes. In 2019, the World Health Organization officially recognized traditional Chinese medicine in its global medical compendium, not as alternative medicine. As medicine, a legitimate therapeutic system with documented efficacy for numerous conditions. That recognition represented a fundamental shift in how global medical institutions view Eastern practices. While Western medicine learned to fight disease, Eastern medicine learned to prevent it from starting, and for 5,000 years it worked. But philosophy alone doesn't heal. Eastern medicine combined theory with one of the most extensive pharmacological systems ever developed. A Chinese woman named Tuesday Yuyo had a problem. It was 1969, and the Vietnam War was killing more soldiers through malaria than through combat. Modern anti-malarial drugs were failing. Resistance had spread. Nothing worked anymore. The Chinese government assembled a team of scientists and gave them an impossible task: find a cure. Tuesday Yu didn't start in a laboratory. She started in a library. She began reading ancient medical texts, searching through centuries of documented herbal treatments. In a text from 340 CE, she found a reference to sweet wormwood, Qinghao, used to treat fever. The description was brief, the preparation method was unusual, but something about it felt promising. She extracted compounds from the plant, tested them, failed, tried different methods, failed again. Then she noticed a detail in the ancient text. The herb shouldn't be boiled, but soaked in cold water. She adjusted her extraction process to match the ancient method. The compound she isolated, artemisinin, killed malaria parasites that every modern drug had failed against. Artemisinin is now the World Health Organization's primary treatment for malaria. It saves millions of lives annually. In 2015, Tuesday Yu won the Nobel Prize in Medicine, not for discovering something new, for rediscovering something ancient that actually worked. A plant Chinese doctors had used for 2,000 years just because it worked turned out to be one of the most important anti-malarial compounds ever found. This isn't an isolated case. Approximately 25% of modern prescription drugs are derived from plants, and many of those plants were used in traditional medicine first. Ephedrine, extracted from mahuang, a plant Chinese medicine used for respiratory issues for 5,000 years, became the basis for decongestants and asthma medications. Western pharmaceutical companies isolated the active compound, synthesized it, and sold it as modern medicine. But Chinese herbalists had been using the original plant for millennia. Aspirin, acetyl salicylic acid, came from willow bark. Greek physicians prescribed willow bark for pain and inflammation. So did Ayurvedic practitioners in India. European folk healers used it for fever. Everyone knew it worked. In 1897, a chemist at Bayer finally isolated and synthesized the active compound. We called it a modern breakthrough. It was ancient knowledge reformulated. The sophistication of traditional pharmacology is staggering. The Shenong Ben Cao Jing Divine Pharma Materia Medica, compiled around 200 CE, listed 365 medicines. Each entry included the plant's properties, what conditions it treated, proper dosage, and potential side effects. Later compilations expanded this catalogue. By the Ming Dynasty, Chinese Materia Medica documented over 11,000 medicinal substances. These weren't vague folk remedies. They were detailed pharmaceutical protocols. Ancient herbalists understood drug interactions, which plants shouldn't be combined, which enhanced each other's effects. They knew dosages needed adjustment based on patient weight and age. They understood that preparation methods mattered. The same plant, raw versus cooked versus fermented, produced different medicinal effects. This was pharmacology without chemistry, built through millennia of observation and experimentation. A healer would try a plant on a patient, note the effects, adjust the dose. Try a different preparation method. Test combinations. Document results. Pass successful treatments to the next generation. Over thousands of years across millions of patients, patterns emerged. Knowledge accumulated. What worked was kept. What failed was discarded. Modern medicine dismisses many traditional herbal remedies as unproven. But unproven doesn't mean ineffective. It means unstudied. And there is a reason they remain unstudied. Pharmaceutical companies can't patent natural substances. They can't profit from a plant anyone can grow. So there is no financial incentive to fund expensive clinical trials on traditional remedies. You can patent a synthetic compound derived from a plant. You can't patent the plant itself. That is why pharmaceutical companies isolate active ingredients, modify them slightly, and sell the patented version. The traditional remedy that inspired it remains alternative medicine, while the synthetic derivative becomes real medicine. Recent research has begun filling this gap. Studies testing traditional formulas with modern methodology are finding remarkable results. Turmeric, used in Ayurvedic medicine for inflammation for thousands of years, contains curcumin, which multiple studies now show has legitimate anti-inflammatory and potentially anti-cancer properties. Ginseng, a cornerstone of Chinese medicine for energy and immunity, has demonstrated measurable effects on fatigue and immune function in clinical trials. Ginger, used across Asian medicine for nausea and digestive issues, is now validated as an effective antiemetic. The pattern is consistent. Traditional remedies that survived centuries of use tend to have real pharmacological activity when finally tested scientifically. Ancient herbalists didn't understand biochemistry or molecular mechanisms, but they understood results. And results, accumulated over generations, created a pharmacological database more extensive than any modern pharmaceutical catalogue. How much more is out there? How many traditional remedies sit in ancient texts, documented and used successfully for centuries, waiting for modern science to finally test them? The plants were Eastern medicine's pharmacy, a catalogue of treatments so vast that we're still discovering its contents thousands of years later. But their diagnostic tool was even more extraordinary. The Chinese physician sat across from the patient, saying nothing. 3 fingers rested gently on the patient's wrist, not checking heart rate, not timing anything, just feeling. The pressure was light, barely touching the skin, then slightly deeper. Then deeper still. The physician moved to a different position on the wrist. Then another. 6 locations on each wrist, 3 depths at each position. held for long moments of focused attention. After 5 minutes of silence, the physician spoke. "You're pregnant. About 3 weeks." The woman stared. She hadn't told anyone. She'd suspected but wasn't certain. Modern pregnancy tests wouldn't detect it for another week. "How did you know?" "Your pulse told me." Western medicine calls this impossible. The pulse reveals heart rate and rhythm, nothing more. You can't detect pregnancy from a wrist pulse weeks before hormones are measurable in urine. Yet Chinese physicians have done exactly this for thousands of years. And when researchers finally tested them under controlled conditions, they were right more often than chance would allow. Traditional Chinese pulse diagnosis identifies 28 different pulse qualities at 3 positions on each wrist. Each position supposedly corresponds to different organ systems, each quality floating, sinking, slippery, choppy, wiry, tight, slow, rapid, indicates specific conditions. A trained practitioner can allegedly detect pregnancy, identify tumors before symptoms appear, diagnose organ dysfunction that blood tests later confirm. For centuries, Western medicine dismissed this as theatrical nonsense. Then, studies started appearing from Chinese medical universities. Practitioners diagnosed conditions in blinded trials. They felt pulses without knowing patient histories or test results. Their diagnoses were compared against modern diagnostic tools. The accuracy wasn't perfect, but it was statistically significant. Something real was being detected. The theoretical explanation is surprisingly plausible. Different organs generate slightly different pressure waves in arterial blood flow, heart function, kidney filtration, liver metabolism. Each creates subtle variations in how blood moves through vessels. A pulse isn't one uniform sensation. It is a complex waveform containing information about multiple physiological processes. Modern biometric sensors can now measure these variations. The pulse differences the ancient Chinese described actually exist. What seems impossible is that human fingers could detect them. But the training explains how. Students spend years, often a decade or more, feeling pulses under supervision. They feel thousands of wrists, learning to distinguish textures their teacher describes. This is slippery. Feel how it comes and goes smoothly, like pearls rolling. This is wiry, tense, resistant, like pressing a guitar string. The vocabulary sounds poetic, but it represents embodied knowledge. You can't learn it from books. You must feel it repeatedly until your nervous system learns to recognize patterns your conscious mind can barely articulate. This is why pulse diagnosis remained largely oral tradition. It is not knowledge that translates well to written instruction. It is a physical skill, like learning to identify wine varieties by taste or wood species by touch. Expertise develops through direct experience, not theoretical study. Western medicine abandoned sophisticated pulse diagnosis when technology arrived. The stethoscope, blood pressure cuff, EE, these provided objective, measurable, standardizable data. Why rely on subjective interpretation when machines could give precise numbers? Standardization improved consistency, but something was lost. The clinical acumen that ancient physicians developed through decades of tactile observation largely disappeared from modern training. Now, researchers are trying to bring it back. Pulse wave analysis using sensitive instruments. Artificial intelligence systems trained to detect patterns in arterial flow that correlate with disease states. Modern technology attempting to replicate what Chinese physicians learned to do with their fingers 3,000 years ago. Eastern medicine mastered the art of reading subtle signs, detecting information the body constantly broadcasts, but that most observers miss. But some ancient healers took this even further. Not just reading the body, but understanding the mind's power over it. The Amazon rainforest contains approximately 80,000 plant species. Most are toxic. Some will kill you within hours. Others cause paralysis, hallucinations, organ failure. Walking through the jungle and randomly sampling plants would be suicide. Yet indigenous Amazonian healers can navigate this botanical minefield with precision. They know which bark treats malaria, which vine reduces inflammation, which leaf stops bleeding, which root kills parasites. They've identified hundreds of medicinal plants among tens of thousands of species. many of which modern science has now validated as pharmacologically effective. The question that haunts ethnobotanists is simple. How did they know? Consider ayahuasca. It requires combining two specific plants, Banisteriopsis casapi vine and Psychotria viridis leaves. Neither plant alone produces the effect. The vine contains MAO inhibitors, the leaves contain DMT. Only when combined in precise proportions does the mixture become psychoactive. The chemical interaction is so specific that discovering it by random experimentation seems nearly impossible. Yet Amazonian shamans have used this exact combination for thousands of years. When asked how they discovered it, indigenous healers give an answer Western scientists find uncomfortable. The plants told them. Through dreams, visions, altered states of consciousness, the plants themselves communicated their properties and uses. Modern science dismisses this as metaphor or mythology, but the knowledge is real. The treatments work. Whether the acquisition method was careful observation over generations, systematic trial and error over millennia, or something we don't have language to describe, the result is sophisticated pharmacological understanding. Quinine, extracted from cinchona bark, became the Western world's primary malaria treatment. Indigenous Peruvian healers had used it for centuries before Spanish conquistadors learned about it. Curare, used by indigenous hunters as a poison that causes muscle paralysis, is now used in surgery as a muscle relaxant during anesthesia. Tea tree oil, identified by Australian Aboriginal healers for its antimicrobial properties, is now in countless antiseptic products. Chaparral, used by Native Americans for kidney ailments, contains compounds researchers are studying for their potential therapeutic effects. The list extends for pages. Plant after plant, indigenous knowledge validated by modern chemistry, not primitive guessing, not superstitious ritual, effective medicine based on deep understanding of local ecosystems. But this knowledge came at a cost indigenous communities rarely shared. Pharmaceutical companies engaged in what is now called biopiracy, extracting traditional knowledge, isolating plant compounds, patenting them, and profiting enormously while giving nothing back to the source communities. The rosy periwinkle from Madagascar produced compounds that became crucial cancer drugs, earning billions. The communities who'd known about the plant's properties for generations received nothing. This pattern repeated globally. Traditional knowledge treated as free resource to be exploited rather than intellectual property to be respected. Only recently have international agreements begun establishing benefit, sharing requirements, ensuring that when traditional knowledge leads to commercial products, the originating communities receive compensation. But much of the knowledge is vanishing before it can even be documented, let alone shared or protected. Indigenous languages die every few weeks. When a language disappears, so does the knowledge encoded within it. Plant names, preparation methods, treatment protocols that exist only in oral tradition. Elders pass away without apprentices to receive their wisdom. Younger generations move to cities, losing connection to traditional practices. Rainforests are destroyed, eliminating the plants before scientists can study them. Ethnobotanists work desperately to document what remains. They estimate that 80% of indigenous pharmacological knowledge has never been written down, never been studied, never been validated by modern science. It exists only in the memories of aging healers in remote communities. When those healers die, their knowledge dies with them. This isn't just historical tragedy, it is happening now. Today, plants that could treat diseases we can't cure are going extinct before we identify them. Traditional knowledge that took thousands of years to accumulate is disappearing within a single generation. The urgency is different from the ancient losses we've explored. Those happened centuries ago. We can mourn them, but can't prevent them. Indigenous knowledge is being lost right now in real time. And unlike ancient texts that might be rediscovered in an archaeological dig, this knowledge, when gone, is gone forever. Indigenous medicine wasn't just about identifying plants. It was about relationship between healer and patient, between humans and nature, between physical and spiritual health. The patient had been sick for months, chronic pain, exhaustion, weight loss. The village healer examined them and prescribed not a plant or potion, but a ceremony. 3 nights of ritual, drumming, dancing, singing, the entire community participating. At the end, the patient felt better. Within weeks, the symptoms had diminished. Within months, they were gone. Western medicine would call this placebo, as if that makes it less real. The placebo effect isn't imagination. It is measurable neurobiological healing triggered by belief, expectation, and context. When patients believe they're receiving effective treatment, their brains release endorphins and other healing compounds. Immune function improves. Inflammation decreases. Pain perception changes. The healing is physical, documented in blood tests and imaging studies. It is just not caused by the chemical properties of the treatment. It is caused by the mind's response to the treatment. Indigenous healing traditions understood this intuitively and built practices that maximized the mind's healing power. Native American sweat lodge ceremonies weren't just about physical purification through heat and steam. They were psychological interventions. The preparation, the fasting, the prayers, the intention, setting, the sensory experience, darkness, heat, the smell of burning sage, the social element, community members gathering to support the healing. The narrative framework, understanding illness as spiritual imbalance and healing as restoration of harmony. Every element worked together to create powerful expectation of healing. African ritual drumming ceremonies induce altered states of consciousness. The rhythmic stimulation affects brain wave patterns, shifting consciousness away from analytical thinking toward more emotional and intuitive states. Modern neuroscience shows that these trance states alter brain chemistry, increasing dopamine and endorphin production, reducing cortical activity in regions associated with self-consciousness and anxiety. The participants aren't pretending. Their brain chemistry is actually changing. Aboriginal healing songs serve multiple functions. The melodic patterns themselves have emotional effects. The lyrics often tell stories of previous healings, creating expectation that this healing will succeed too. The participation of community members provides social support and emotional validation. Modern research in psychoneuroimmunology confirms what these practices intuitively grasped. Mental and emotional states directly affect physical health. Chronic stress suppresses immune function. Loneliness increases inflammation. Social isolation slows wound healing. Belief in recovery improves surgical outcomes. These aren't metaphors or spiritual concepts. They're measurable physiological effects. Ancient healers didn't have the scientific terms. They didn't understand neurotransmitters or immune cells, but they created practices that addressed these factors systematically. They knew that healing required more than just physical intervention. It required engaging the patient's mind, emotions, social connections, and sense of meaning. Research comparing healing rituals to standard medical treatment has found something striking. When the physical treatment is identical, but one group receives it within a ritual context, with ceremony, community participation, meaningful narrative, that group shows better outcomes. The ritual doesn't replace medicine, it enhances it. How treatment is delivered matters as much as what treatment is delivered. Modern medical encounters have become sterile by comparison. A patient sits in an exam room. A doctor enters, eyes on a computer screen, typing notes. The examination is brief, clinical, impersonal. A prescription is issued. The appointment ends. There is no ceremony, no story, no community, no meaning beyond "take this pill." Some patients heal, but others remain sick despite technically correct treatment. We call them difficult cases or suggest psychosomatic factors. What if the problem isn't the treatment, but the lack of context that makes treatment effective? The criticism "it is all in your head" misses the point entirely. Yes, and your head is connected to your body. Your brain regulates your immune system, modulates inflammation, controls pain perception, affects healing speed. Mental healing is still healing. It is just healing that works through different mechanisms than chemical drugs. Modern medicine is slowly rediscovering this. Some hospitals play music during surgery, reducing patient anxiety and improving outcomes. Medical schools now train doctors in empathetic communication, recognizing that bedside manner has therapeutic value. Palliative care integrates psychological and social support alongside physical treatment. These aren't luxuries, they're medicine. Indigenous healing traditions never separated mind from body, person from community, physical from spiritual. They understood healing as holistic, requiring intervention on multiple levels simultaneously. Ritual engaged the mind and emotions. But indigenous healers understood something even more fundamental. Healing doesn't happen in isolation. It happens in community. When someone fell ill in a traditional indigenous community, the entire village responded. Not just the healer, everyone. Women prepared special foods. Men gathered medicinal plants. Children were kept quiet near the sick person's dwelling. Elders told stories of previous recoveries. The community gathered for ceremonies. Healing wasn't something that happened to an isolated individual. It was a collective effort. This wasn't charity or kindness, though it was both. It was medicine. The community itself was therapeutic intervention. Modern research has finally caught up to what indigenous cultures always knew. Loneliness is a disease risk factor as significant as smoking 15 cigarettes daily. Social isolation increases mortality risk by 30%. Conversely, strong social networks improve recovery from surgery, reduce cancer recurrence, speed healing from heart disease, and protect against mental illness. Connection heals. Isolation kills. Yet modern healthcare has systematically removed community from healing. Patients lie in hospital rooms alone. Visiting hours restrict family access. After discharge, recovery happens at home while everyone else goes to work. The sick person lies in bed, scrolling through their phone, isolated with maybe a daily check-in call. We've medicalized disease while completely ignoring the social context that determines whether people actually get better. Indigenous healing practices centered community involvement. The Imyori concept of Weneo Ora family health recognized that you can't treat an individual in isolation. If someone is sick, you must address their entire family system, their relationships, their social support, their sense of belonging. Treating just the individual while ignoring their context was considered medical malpractice. African Ubuntu philosophy expressed this as "I am because we are." Individual health doesn't exist separately from community well-being. When one person suffers, the community suffers. When one person heals, the community strengthens. This wasn't metaphysical philosophy, it was practical public health. Strong communities kept people healthy. Fragmented communities made people sick. Native American talking circles brought illness into open discussion. The sick person shared their experience, community members offered support, shared similar struggles, provided perspective. There was no shame, no isolation. Illness was treated as a normal part of life that required communal response, not personal failure requiring private suffering. These practices created psychological and social conditions that supported healing. The sick person felt valued, supported, connected. They had purpose. Their healing mattered not just to them, but to everyone. They had hope, others had recovered, and the community believed they would too. They had practical help. Food, care, reduced stress. Modern healthcare is slowly rediscovering these principles. Some clinics now offer group medical appointments where patients with similar conditions meet together, share experiences, support each other, and see the doctor collectively. Outcomes are better than individual appointments. Cancer centers create patient support circles. Family-centered care units allow families to stay with hospitalized patients. Hospices emphasize community and relationship, not just pain management. These aren't innovations, they're returns to ancient wisdom about the social nature of healing. We lost more than medical formulas and surgical techniques. We lost understanding that humans are fundamentally social creatures whose health depends on connection. That healing happens in relationship, not isolation. That community isn't luxury or supplement to medical care. It is medical care. In an era of increasing loneliness, where people live alone, work remotely, and interact primarily through screens, this ancient wisdom feels desperately relevant. The loneliness epidemic isn't separate from our health crisis. It is causing it. Ancient healers knew what modern research just proved. Loneliness can kill you faster than heart disease. Indigenous medicine preserved this community wisdom through thousands of years, but another ancient tradition took a different path, perfecting individual anatomy knowledge and performing surgical procedures that modern medicine thought impossible. On the Greek island of Kos, around 460 BCE, a physician named Hippocrates did something radical. He looked at a sick patient and said the illness wasn't punishment from angry gods. It wasn't demons or curses or divine displeasure. It was natural. Diseases had causes that could be observed, understood, and treated through human knowledge rather than prayer. This declaration changed medicine forever. Before Hippocrates, healing belonged to priests and temples. Illness meant spiritual failure. Recovery required appeasing deities. The physician was intermediary between patient and gods, performing rituals more than treatments. Hippocrates separated medicine from religion. He insisted that diseases followed patterns, that symptoms had meaning, that careful observation revealed truths about how the body worked. The Hippocratic Oath, still taken by graduating medical students 400 years later, established ethical principles that became medicine's moral foundation. First, do no harm, maintain patient confidentiality, refuse to exploit the vulnerable. Teach medical knowledge freely to the next generation. These weren't just rules. They were recognition that medicine carried power and that power required ethical constraints. But the oath is what people remember. What they forget is what Hippocrates actually taught about how to practice medicine. The Hippocratic corpus, over 60 texts written by Hippocrates and his followers, covered every aspect of medical knowledge in ancient Greece. Not recipes or rituals, but systematic observation. Hippocrates documented what he saw in sick patients. He noted patterns. He recorded which treatments helped and which didn't. He taught students to observe carefully, think critically, and base decisions on evidence rather than assumption. Some of his observations remained accurate for millennia. He described clubbed fingers, where fingertips become rounded and nails curve downward, in patients with chronic lung disease. Modern medicine still calls this Hippocratic fingers, a clinical sign doctors check for when diagnosing respiratory conditions. He detailed seizure patterns that match modern epilepsy classifications. He recognized that injuries to one side of the head could cause paralysis on the opposite side of the body, demonstrating understanding that the brain's hemispheres control opposite sides, knowledge that would be scientifically proven for 2,000 years. His theory of the four humours, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, was biochemically wrong. The body doesn't work through balancing mystical fluids. Yet the theory represented something crucial: systematic thinking about health as balance, about personality and physiology connecting, about treatment requiring individualized assessment rather than one size fits all protocols. The theory was wrong, but the approach was right. Hippocratic medicine's greatest legacy wasn't any specific treatment. It was methodology. Observe patients carefully, document what you see, look for patterns, test treatments, record results, teach others what you learn. This became the foundation of evidence-based medicine, the principle that medical decisions should rest on documented observation rather than tradition or authority. Modern doctors follow this Hippocratic model every day. Observe symptoms, form hypotheses, test them, revise understanding based on evidence. Medical education, clinical trials, peer review, all flow from principles Hippocrates established 2,400 years ago. Yet we've abandoned other parts of his teaching. Hippocrates emphasized treating the whole patient, physical symptoms, yes, but also mental state, living conditions, diet, exercise, social circumstances. Modern medicine has become reductionist. We treat diseases, not people. We focus on symptoms while ignoring context. A patient with chronic pain gets prescriptions, not questions about their life stress. sleep quality, or emotional well-being. Hippocrates taught that prevention was paramount, that lifestyle modifications often worked better than interventions, that the body had innate healing capacity that doctors should support rather than override. Modern medicine is reactive. We wait for disease to develop, then attack it aggressively. Prevention and lifestyle medicine remain underfunded, undervalued, considered less important than pharmaceutical and surgical interventions. He recognized that healing often meant supporting the body's natural recovery, that aggressive intervention sometimes harmed more than helped, that doctors should be humble about the limits of their knowledge and the wisdom of the body's own systems. Modern medicine can be arrogant. We assume we know better than millions of years of evolutionary biology. We intervene constantly, sometimes disrupting processes that would have resolved naturally. The medical oath doctors take today was written 2,400 years ago, but we forgot the most important part of what Hippocrates taught, that medicine is both science and art. That evidence matters, but so does wisdom. That healing requires humility. Hippocrates gave us medical philosophy, the framework for ethical, observational, evidence-based practice that modern medicine rests upon. But another Greek physician, centuries later, would give us something equally fundamental. Not philosophy, but anatomy. The gladiator collapsed in the arena, blood pouring from a deep wound across his abdomen. The crowd roared. Slaves carried him to the medical chamber beneath the Colosseum, where Galen waited. The physician was 30 years old, already famous, personally appointed to care for Rome's gladiators. He had minutes to stop the bleeding and save the man's life. Galen didn't panic. He'd seen inside the human body more than any physician in history. Not through dissection, Roman law forbade cutting open human corpses, but through wounds, deep, terrible wounds that exposed muscles, organs, bone, injuries that would kill most men, but that Galen had learned to repair. The gladiator arena was his laboratory. Every fight was an anatomy lesson written in blood. He worked quickly, stopped the hemorrhaging, cleaned the wound, sutured layers of tissue with precision that wouldn't be matched for over 1,000 years. The gladiator survived. Most of Galen's patients did. Survival rates so high that modern surgeons reading his case notes initially assumed he was exaggerating. What Galen learned in the arena, he documented in over 20,000 pages of medical writing. His anatomical knowledge would dominate medicine for 1,500 years, longer than any medical text before or since. He corrected errors that had persisted for centuries. Greek physicians believed arteries carried air, not blood. The name artery literally means air holder. Galen proved through careful observation and animal experimentation that arteries carried blood. A simple fact, but one that had been wrong for 400 years. He mapped the nervous system, proved that the brain, not the heart, controlled the body, distinguished between motor nerves that commanded movement and sensory nerves that transmitted feeling. He performed experiments on animals, cutting specific nerves and observing which functions were lost, essentially inventing neuroscience through methodical vivisection. He described the heart's valves, traced blood flow through chambers. He understood circulation imperfectly. He missed that blood circulates in a closed loop, believing instead that it was continuously produced and consumed. But his descriptions of cardiac anatomy were accurate enough that they remained standard teaching until the Renaissance. His surgical skills were extraordinary. He performed cataract surgery, inserting a needle into the eye to dislodge clouded lenses, removed bladder stones through abdominal incisions, repaired skull fractures by removing bone fragments and covering the opening with metal plates, operated on deep battle wounds, cleaning debris from muscle and organ tissue, preserving nerves and blood vessels with precision. He even performed what we now call brain surgery, trepanation to relieve pressure after head trauma, careful removal of bone fragments from the brain's surface. His surgical notes describe techniques, angle of approach, which blood vessels to avoid, how to recognize when you've gone too deep, that modern neurosurgeons recognize as fundamentally sound. But Galen's legacy became a prison. His work was so comprehensive, so authoritative, that it became gospel. For over 1,000 years, European physicians treated Galen's writings as infallible. To challenge Galen was to challenge truth itself. When Andreas Vesalius performed human dissections in 1543 and discovered that Galen had made errors, mistakes from extrapolating animal anatomy to humans, Vesalius faced vicious attacks. He was called heretic, charlatan, defiler of the dead. Some called for his execution. Galen had been wrong about some things. The errors weren't his fault. He de-worked within the constraints of Roman law that prohibited human dissection, but treating his work as unchangeable truth stifled progress for centuries. Ancient wisdom became ancient chains. The irony is that Galen himself would have hated this. He was an experimentalist. He constantly tested and revised his understanding. He explicitly told students to verify his claims rather than accept them on authority. But after his death, his methodology was forgotten while his conclusions became doctrine. Many of Galen's surgical techniques were lost during medieval Europe's medical decline. Centuries passed before surgeons could match what he accomplished in the Roman arena. Now, studying his texts, modern neurosurgeons are rediscovering approaches Galen used 1800 years ago. Techniques for accessing deep brain structures, methods for preserving nerve function during surgery. His work was so advanced that we're still catching up. A Roman surgeon performed brain surgery and kept his patients alive. Then we forgot how he did it. But Galen understood something that Roman civilization grasped better than most. Individual medical skill, no matter how advanced, could only save individuals. To save populations, you needed something else entirely. Galen could save one gladiator at a time, one patient, one surgery, one life. But while he worked in the arena, Roman engineers were saving millions. They didn't do it with scalpels or medicines. They did it with stone, concrete, and water. The Aqua Claudia stretched 43 miles from mountain springs to the heart of Rome. It was one of 11 aqueducts supplying the city with water, over 200 gallons per person, per Dalton Y, more water per capita than many modern cities provide. This wasn't tea luxury. It was public health infrastructure on a scale the world wouldn't see again for 1700 years. Clean water prevented disease. The Romans didn't understand germ theory. They could see bacteria or know about waterborne pathogens, but they observed. Communities with clean water stayed healthier than communities drinking from contaminated wells. Children survived childhood at higher rates. Epidemics spread more slowly. The correlation was clear enough to justify massive engineering investment. The Cloaca Maxima Rome Great Sewer carried waste out of the city through underground channels. Public toilets throughout Rome connected to flowing water systems that continuously flushed waste away. Compare this to medieval European cities where people dumped chamber pots into streets, where waste piled in corners and courtyards, where every rain turned roads into rivers of sewage. Rome had solved these problems 1,000 years before medieval Europe would even recognize them as problems. Public baths weren't just about cleanliness, though that mattered. They were social centers where Romans bathed daily, maintaining hygiene levels that medieval Europeans would consider obsessive and unnecessary. The baths used heated water from aqueducts, had changing rooms and exercise areas, and crucially were accessible to everyone. Rich and poor alike bathed regularly. Public health isn't just infrastructure. It is infrastructure that everyone can access. Roman public health regulations showed systematic thinking about disease prevention. Burials were banned inside city limits. Bodies transmitted disease. The Romans didn't know how, but they knew the pattern. Keep the dead outside the city, and fewer living people got sick. Food markets had inspectors checking for spoiled meat and contaminated grain. Quarantine protocols isolated people with infectious diseases. Military camps maintained strict sanitation standards because sick soldiers lost battles. The demographic evidence is striking. Life expectancy in Roman cities exceeded medieval cities by years. Infant mortality was lower. Epidemic diseases still occurred. They could prevent everything, but they spread more slowly, killed fewer people, and ended sooner because Roman infrastructure limited transmission. This wasn't because Roman doctors were better than medieval doctors. It was because Roman engineers understood something fundamental. Medicine isn't just treating sick people. It is preventing people from getting sick in the first place. Then Rome fell. The aqueducts broke. Nobody repaired them. The knowledge of how to build them faded. The sewers filled with debris and stopped flowing. The public baths closed. The regulations disappeared. European cities regressed to conditions worse than anything Rome had tolerated. Medieval London had no sewage system. Waste piled in streets. The Thames became an open sewer. Disease was constant. Infant mortality was catastrophic. Life expectancy plummeted. Medieval Paris was worse. Medieval Rome, the same city that once had 11 aqueducts, had people drinking from contaminated wells and throwing waste into streets. It wasn't gradual decline. It was catastrophic regression. Europe forgot that clean water mattered, forgot that waste disposal prevented disease, forgot that public health required infrastructure and investment and systematic thinking. The irony is brutal. Modern public health emerged in the 1800s as if it were revolutionary. John Snow mapping cholera to contaminated wells in 1854 was praised as genius. Joseph Bazalgette building London's sewer system in the 1860s was called unprecedented innovation, but Rome had understood these principles 1700 years earlier. Snow rediscovered what Roman engineers knew. Bazalgette rebuilt what Rome had already built. The foundations of modern epidemiology and public health, clean water, waste management, food safety, quarantine, hygiene promotion, aren't modern inventions. They Roman innovations that we forgot and eventually remembered. Roman engineering saved more lives than Roman doctors. Then we forgot that medicine isn't just about treating the sick but preventing sickness. Rome proved that prevention works, but after Rome fell, Europe entered a medical dark age. The knowledge we've explored began disappearing. Some of it vanished in fire and war, some was deliberately destroyed, and some simply slipped away, forgotten. The village healer had treated 3 women for persistent fever. All 3 recovered, word spread. More patients came. She mixed herbs grown in her garden, prepared poultices using recipes her grandmother had taught her, advised on diet and rest. People got better, the local priest noticed. Healing without church approval. Medical knowledge without formal training. Herbs that worked better than his prayers. He reported her to authorities. Within a month, she was burning at the stake. They called them witches. They were herbalists, midwives, and healers. And when they died, their knowledge of ancient medicine died with them. Between 1450 and 1750, European authorities executed an estimated 40 to 60,000 people for witchcraft. The trials are usually framed as superstition or mass hysteria, religious paranoia, scapegoating during times of plague and famine. But look closer at who was accused and why. The majority were women. Many were healers. Their crime wasn't consorting with demons. It was possessing medical knowledge outside institutional control. As Christianity consolidated power, the church monopolized healing. Monastery hospitals, priests, physicians trained in church, approved methods. Medicine became religious territory. Traditional healers, especially women practicing herbal medicine and midwifery, existed outside this system. They were competition. Worse, they were often more effective. A woman successfully treating ailments that church physicians could heal was evidence of something. Either her methods worked, which undermined medical authority, or she had supernatural help, which made her dangerous. Either way, the solution was elimination. Anna Goeldi, a German midwife, was executed in Switzerland in 1782. Her crime: successfully treating women's reproductive health issues using herbal preparations. The official charge was witchcraft. The actual threat was competence outside approved channels. Alice Catella, an Irish healer in the 1320s, was accused of witchcraft after investigators found suspicious herbs and ointments in her home. They were medicinal plants. She had been treating patients successfully for years. That success made her suspect. Countless unnamed healers faced similar fates. Accused, tried, executed, their herbs burned, their books destroyed, their gardens razed, and crucially, their apprentices dispersed or killed. The knowledge didn't just die with the individual healer, it died with the entire lineage of transmission. Written texts can be copied. One book burns, but if another copy exists elsewhere, the knowledge survives. Oral traditions and apprentice-based learning are fragile. When the knowledge holder dies without passing it on, that information is gone permanently. No recovery, no rediscovery, just extinction. The pattern extended globally. Spanish conquistadors didn't just burn Mayan codices. They killed the healers who could have recreated that knowledge. Colonial authorities in Africa persecuted traditional healers, dismissing their practices as primitive superstition while simultaneously outlawing them. During China's Cultural Revolution, traditional medicine practitioners were attacked as counter-revolutionary. Their texts were destroyed, many were killed. Lineages that had transmitted knowledge for generations were broken. The calculation is chilling. Conservative estimates suggest each traditional healer possessed detailed knowledge of 200 to 300 medicinal plants. Which species treated which conditions, how to prepare them, proper dosages, contraindications, seasonal variations. If 40,000 healers were executed during the European witch trials alone, and each knew 250 plant medicines, that is 10 million pieces of botanical medical knowledge lost. 10 million potential treatments that we'll never recover, because the people who held that information were burned, drowned, hanged, or pressed to death. This wasn't collateral damage. This was systematic elimination of medical knowledge that threatened institutional power. Medicine is authority. Those who control access to healing control populations. Independent healers, especially women whose knowledge passed mother to daughter outside official structures, represented autonomy. They had to be eliminated. The loss wasn't just personal or even generational, it was civilizational. We're still living with the consequences. Modern herbalism has to rediscover plants that were common knowledge 400 years ago. Midwifery techniques that were standard practice had to be painstakingly reconstructed. The accumulated wisdom of countless generations of healers vanished within a few centuries of systematic persecution. The healers were killed, but their books could have survived. Physical texts are harder to destroy than people, yet even written knowledge became a target, sometimes by accident of war, sometimes by deliberate censorship. The Library of Alexandria burned. That is the story everyone knows. But what most people don't know is that some medical texts survived the initial fire. They were housed in smaller satellite collections, in private libraries of physicians, in temple archives scattered across Egypt. The knowledge could have been preserved, copied, passed forward. Then Christian authorities took control of Alexandria. Pagan texts were heretical. Medical knowledge from non-Christian sources was suspect. The surviving medical manuscripts were gathered and systematically destroyed, not by accident, by policy. The final destruction of Alexandria's medical knowledge was collateral damage of war. It was deliberate erasure of competing information. This pattern repeated across Europe as Christianity consolidated power. In 1559, the Catholic Church established the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the list of prohibited books. It banned thousands of texts considered dangerous to faith or morals. Buried in that list were medical texts, anatomical studies that contradicted church teaching about the human body, works on reproductive health that provided information the church wanted controlled. Most significantly, texts describing herbal contraceptives. Ancient physicians, Egyptian, Greek, Roman, Persian, had documented plant-based methods for preventing pregnancy. Formulas using specific herbs in precise combinations. The knowledge was 2,000 years old, tested across countless generations. documented in multiple medical traditions. The church banned those books. Possessing them became a crime. The formulas were lost not through fire or decay, but through institutional censorship. Medieval European medicine regressed partly because advanced Greek and Roman medical texts were forbidden. Galen's surgical techniques, Hippocrates' diagnostic methods, pharmacological knowledge accumulated over centuries. These texts were labeled pagan, heretical, potentially corrupting. Better to let people suffer and die than allow access to non-Christian medical knowledge. Meanwhile, Islamic scholars were preserving exactly what Europe was destroying. They translated Greek and Roman medical texts into Arabic, expanded on them, kept the knowledge alive. But European Christians could access these texts without learning Arabic and admitting that Islamic civilization was medically superior. Not until the Renaissance, when desperation finally outweighed dogma, did European scholars begin translating Arabic medical texts back into Latin, rediscovering knowledge their ancestors had deliberately destroyed centuries earlier. The scale of loss is staggering. Galen wrote over 600 medical texts. About 100 survive. We have fragments, references, quotations in other works, but the complete knowledge he documented is gone. Hippocrates' corpus represents surviving pieces of a much larger body of work. How much larger we'll never know, because the texts that would tell us are among those lost. Chinese imperial libraries contained medical manuscripts accumulated over dynasties. Then political purges came, new emperors burning the previous dynasty's records. The Cultural Revolution targeting traditional knowledge as counter-revolutionary. Thousands of medical texts destroyed because they represented old thinking, old power structures, old ways of understanding the body that conflicted with new ideologies. Economic suppression played a role too. Medieval European guild systems restricted medical knowledge to small professional groups. Treatments were trade secrets. Apprentices swore oaths never to reveal formulas to outsiders. This protected guild members from competition, but made medical knowledge fragile. When a guild collapsed or a lineage of practitioners died out, their treatments disappeared with them. This pattern persists. Pharmaceutical companies patent medicines restricting access and information. Trade secret laws protect formulas from public knowledge. Corporate control of medical research means studies that don't serve profit motives don't get funded, negative results aren't published. Effective but unpatentable treatments get ignored. Knowledge suppression didn't end with the Renaissance. It just changed mechanisms. Access to medical knowledge has always been political. Those in power decide what information is acceptable, what is dangerous, what deserves preservation, and what should be destroyed. Sometimes the justification is religious orthodoxy. Sometimes it is political ideology. Sometimes it is economic monopoly. The reasons change. The pattern remains. Books could be burned. Healers could be killed. Institutions could censor and suppress. But knowledge is stubborn. Not all of it died. Some survived, hidden in secret, passed down through families, preserved by those who refused to forget. Even when empires fell and libraries burned, some people kept the wisdom alive. While Europe burned books and killed healers, scholars in Baghdad were copying them. The Islamic Golden Age, roughly the 8th through 13th centuries, preserved what Christian Europe was destroying. Greek medical texts that were banned in Rome were translated into Arabic in Damascus. Galen's surgical manuals, Hippocrates' diagnostic protocols, Egyptian pharmacological knowledge. Islamic scholars didn't just preserve these texts, they studied them, expanded them. Al-Razi wrote over 200 medical works, integrating Greek knowledge with Persian and Indian traditions. Ibn Sina, Avicenna to Europeans, compiled a medical encyclopedia so comprehensive, it remained a standard textbook for 600 years. Al-Zahrawi developed surgical instruments and techniques that European surgeons wouldn't match for centuries. They were keeping knowledge alive while Europe forgot it existed. Jewish physicians became bridges. Operating at the intersection of Islamic, Christian, and Jewish cultures, they translated medical texts between Arabic, Hebrew, and Latin. Often they practiced medicine secretly, officially forbidden but unofficially essential. When a Christian king fell ill, he summoned the Jewish physician he'd previously banned. They worked in shadows, copied texts in hiding, and preserved knowledge at great personal risk. Some preservation happened through the very institutions that suppressed other knowledge. Monastic scriptoria, monastery copying rooms, preserved medical manuscripts alongside religious texts. Monks didn't always understand what they were copying. Latin medical terms rendered in careful script by scribes who'd never practiced medicine, but they copied faithfully. When monasteries dissolved or were destroyed, those manuscripts sometimes survived in private collections, waiting centuries to be rediscovered. Romani people, disparagingly called gypsies, carried medical knowledge as they migrated from India through the Middle East into Europe, oral traditions of herbal medicine. Healing practices passed through family lines. European authorities dismissed them as vagabonds and charlatans, but their knowledge preserved elements of Indian Ayurvedic medicine that had otherwise vanished from the West. Alchemists disguised medical knowledge as mystical pursuit. Their texts read like spiritual philosophy, transmuting base metals into gold, seeking the elixir of life. But buried in the mysticism were pharmaceutical formulas. Spirits were distilled plant essences. Planetary influences were code for dosage timing. Sacred geometry disguised chemical proportions. They hid medicine in metaphor to avoid persecution, preserving knowledge for those who could decode it. Many magical grimoires were actually coded medical texts, plant names replaced with demon names, treatment protocols disguised as summoning rituals, preparation instructions hidden in astrological calculations. Modern researchers decoding these texts find legitimate medical knowledge, contraceptive formulas, pain management protocols, surgical techniques, preserved through deliberate obfuscation. Then there are the unnamed, the grandmother who taught her granddaughter one herbal remedy before dying, the physician who buried a medical manuscript before fleeing invading armies hoping someone would find it centuries later, the midwife who secretly trained an apprentice despite laws forbidding women to practice medicine, the monk who hid forbidden texts in monastery walls. Individual acts of preservation that we'll never know about but that kept fragments of knowledge alive. Modern preservationists continue this work. Ethnobotanists racing to document indigenous medical knowledge before the last elders die. Archaeologists carefully excavating and translating fragile medical papyri. Researchers designing clinical trials to validate traditional remedies that skeptical institutions dismissed for decades, each working to save knowledge that is disappearing. Preservation isn't passive, it is not automatic. Knowledge doesn't survive simply because it is valuable. It survives because someone chooses to protect it, often at personal cost, sometimes at risk of death. Those who preserved ancient medical wisdom were heroes, even if we don't know their names. Some knowledge was preserved through their courage, some was lost despite their efforts. But recently, something unexpected began happening. We started finding it again, not buried in libraries or hidden in manuscripts, but validated in laboratories where scientists testing ancient remedies discovered something shocking. They actually work. Tuesday Yu had a problem that modern medicine could solve. It was 1969. Malaria was killing millions. Every anti-malarial drug was failing. Resistance had spread too far. The Chinese government assembled a team of scientists and gave them an impossible task: find a cure where none existed. Tuesday Yu didn't start in a laboratory with molecular modeling and chemical synthesis. She started in a library, reading texts that were over 1,000 years old, ancient medical manuscripts describing treatments Chinese physicians had used for fever. She read through 2,000 traditional remedies, taking notes on anything that mentioned persistent fever or chills. One reference caught her attention. A text from 340 SCA mentioned sweet wormwood Qinghao. The preparation method was unusual. Most herbs were boiled to extract their medicinal properties. This one was soaked in cold water. She extracted compounds from the plant. They didn't work. She tried different methods. Still nothing. She was about to abandon it when she noticed that detail about cold water. She adjusted her extraction process to match the ancient method exactly. Low temperature, no heat. The compound she isolated killed malaria parasites that every modern drug had failed to touch. Artemisinin is now the World Health Organization's primary malaria treatment, saving over 1 million lives annually. In 2015, Tuesday Yu became the first Chinese woman to win the Nobel Prize in Medicine. She won it not for inventing something new, but for rediscovering something ancient that actually worked. Her success changed how scientific institutions view traditional medicine. For decades, ancient remedies were dismissed as folklore. Now pharmaceutical companies and research universities are systematically mining traditional medical texts for leads. The paradigm shifted from ancient medicine is primitive to ancient medicine is an untapped drug discovery database. The validations keep coming. Curcumin from turmeric used in Ayurvedic medicine for inflammation for thousands of years is now in clinical trials for cancer, arthritis, and Alzheimer. Studies show legitimate anti-inflammatory and neuroprotective properties. Resveratrol from grapes, used in ancient wine-based medicines across Mediterranean cultures, is being researched for cardiovascular health with promising results. Traditional Chinese herbal formulas for complex conditions like autoimmune disorders are entering rigorous clinical trials, and many are showing statistically significant effects. Why is this happening now? 3 reasons. First, modern medicine has hit treatment plateaus. Despite billions in research funding, we lack effective therapies for many conditions. Antibiotic resistance is spreading. Chronic diseases are increasing. Novel drug discovery from pure chemistry is becoming exponentially more expensive with diminishing returns. Researchers are desperate for new leads. Ancient medicine offers thousands of years of human trials, treatments that were used successfully enough to be documented and transmitted across generations. Second, technology finally allows us to understand mechanisms. Ancient physicians knew treatments worked but could to explain why. Modern analytical chemistry, genomics, and biochemistry can identify active compounds, understand their mechanisms, and optimize their delivery. We can take empirical observation and give it scientific foundation. Third, there is economic motivation. Pharmaceutical companies realize that traditional medicine represents the world's largest ethnopharmacological database. Plants and formulas already tested for safety and efficacy over millennia. Mining this database is faster and cheaper than starting from scratch with random molecular screening. The methodology is straightforward. Researchers identify traditional remedies with documented effectiveness. They isolate active compounds using modern chemistry. They test those compounds rigorously, cell cultures, animal models, eventually human clinical trials. If validated, they develop them into standardized medications. The irony is almost painful. Ancient people discovered these cures through careful observation and documentation. We dismissed their knowledge as unscientific superstition. Now, we're rediscovering the same compounds and calling it breakthrough innovation. The ancients knew these treatments worked. We're just finally proving why they worked. A scientist won the Nobel Prize by reading a 1600-year-old medical text and finding the cure for malaria that modern medicine missed. That story isn't unique anymore. It is becoming a pattern. Researchers are realizing that ancient medical texts aren't historical curiosities. They're pharmaceutical prospecting guides. Every validated traditional remedy suggests that hundreds more await discovery. The question isn't whether ancient medicine works. The question is how much of it will validate before the texts are lost or the traditional knowledge dies with aging practitioners. Individual ancient remedies are being validated one by one, but some researchers are going further. They're not just extracting isolated compounds from traditional systems, they're trying to understand the entire systems themselves. The patient arrived at Beijing Hospital with stage 3 colon cancer. The oncologist recommended surgery, chemotherapy, radiation, standard Western protocol. But this was China. The hospital offered something else. A consultation with a traditional Chinese medicine practitioner who would work alongside the oncologist. The TCM doctor prescribed herbal formulas to support immune function during chemotherapy, acupuncture sessions to manage side effects, dietary protocols based on thousands of years of observation about how food affects recovery. The treatments ran parallel, conventional medicine attacking the cancer, traditional medicine supporting the body through the attack. The patient's outcomes were measurably better than chemotherapy alone. Less nausea, better energy, stronger immune markers, faster recovery between treatment cycles. This wasn't alternative medicine replacing conventional treatment. This was integration. And research is showing that for many conditions, the combination works better than either approach alone. The most advanced hospitals in the world are combining ancient and modern medicine, not because modern medicine failed, but because it is incomplete. Ancient systems address aspects of health that modern medicine largely ignores. Functional medicine, a growing movement within conventional healthcare, mirrors what ancient physicians practiced. Focus on root causes, not just symptom suppression. Personalized treatment based on individual constitution, not standardized protocols for everyone with the same diagnosis. Prevention and lifestyle modification as primary interventions, not afterthoughts once disease develops. These aren't revolutionary concepts. They're ancient medical philosophy translated into modern terminology. The idea that gut health affects mental health. Ancient Chinese and Ayurvedic medicine built entire treatment systems around that connection thousands of years ago. They called it the relationship between digestive fire and mental clarity. We call it the gut-brain axis, and microbiome research. Same observation, different language. Inflammation as the root of chronic disease. Ayurveda described this concept 3,000 years ago using terms like ama, toxic accumulation that causes systemic imbalance. Modern research on chronic inflammation's role in heart disease, diabetes, autoimmune disorders, and cancer is validating what ancient doctors intuitively understood. Food as medicine. Hippocrates said, "Let food be thy medicine," 2,400 years ago. Chinese medicine developed elaborate dietary therapy systems. Ayurveda classified foods by their effects on body constitution. Modern nutritional science is finally catching up, studying how specific compounds in foods affect gene expression, inflammation, and disease progression. Mind-body medicine represents another rediscovery. For centuries, Western medicine treated mental and physical health as completely separate. Ancient systems never made that distinction. They understood that mental states affect physical health, that emotional stress manifests as physical disease, that healing the mind helps heal the body. Now neuroscience validates what they knew. Chronic stress suppresses immune function, increases inflammation, alters gene expression, and accelerates aging. Meditation and mindfulness, practices dismissed as Eastern mysticism, are now prescribed by conventional doctors for conditions ranging from anxiety to hypertension. Research shows measurable changes in brain structure, immune markers, and cardiovascular health from practices that ancient traditions developed millennia ago. Yoga, Tai Chi, Qigong, movement practices ancient cultures used for health maintenance are entering mainstream medicine not as exercise alternatives, but as therapeutic interventions with documented effects on chronic pain, balance, flexibility, stress response, and even cellular aging. Acupuncture provides perhaps the clearest example of ancient practice meeting modern validation. For decades, Western medicine insisted it was pure placebo. Then research started showing measurable effects: pain reduction, decreased inflammation, changes in brain activity visible on MRI, release of endorphins and other healing compounds, modulation of immune response. We still don't fully understand how it works. The meridian system doesn't correspond to any anatomical structures we recognize, but the effects are real and reproducible. Ancient practitioners didn't need to understand the mechanism. They observed that stimulating specific points created specific therapeutic effects. 2,000 years later, we're validating their observations while still puzzling over their explanations. The future of medicine isn't choosing between ancient wisdom and modern science. It is integration, using ancient systems' holistic understanding of the body as an interconnected whole, combined with modern science's ability to target specific mechanisms and measure precise outcomes. Ancient medicine excels at chronic disease management, prevention, supporting the body's healing capacity. Modern medicine excels at acute intervention, trauma care, precise diagnosis. Together they address the full spectrum of human health needs in ways neither can alone. Individual hospitals are integrating ancient wisdom into modern practice, but some researchers are going even further. They're not just applying ancient principles. They're trying to literally recreate lost ancient medicines, reverse engineering forgotten formulas from archaeological evidence. The researchers at the University of Nottingham were skeptical. They were microbiologists, trained in modern pharmaceutical development. The idea that a 1,000-year-old recipe from a medieval manuscript could kill bacteria seemed absurd, but they received funding to test it, so they followed the instructions exactly. Bold S. Leach book, written in Old English around 900 CE, described a treatment for eye infections. 2 species of allium, garlic and onion or leek, chopped and crushed, wine from a specific type of vessel, ox gall, mixed together and left to ferment for 9 days in a brass container. The recipe was precise about every detail, including the metal of the container and the fermentation duration. They recreated it, mixed the ingredients, waited 9 days, then tested the resulting concoction against MRSA, methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, the antibiotic-resistant superbug that kills thousands annually in hospitals worldwide. The ancient potion killed MRSA more effectively than vancomycin, the modern antibiotic of last resort. The researchers were stunned. They tested it again, same results. They tested it against other resistant bacteria. It worked against multiple strains. A 1,000-year-old recipe, written when germ theory didn't exist, was outperforming 21st century antibiotics. The discovery launched a new field of research, archaeological chemistry, combined with pharmaceutical testing. Scientists analyzing residues in ancient medical vessels using mass spectrometry and DNA analysis, identifying compounds that ancient recipes contained, then recreating those recipes and testing them against modern diseases. The success rate is surprising. Italian researchers recreated Roman surgical instruments from archaeological finds, exact replicas based on surviving bronze tools. When modern surgeons tested them, they discovered the ancient designs were often more ergonomic than assumed. The angles and curves weren't decorative. They were optimized for specific procedures through generations of refinement. Some ancient instruments performed certain tasks better than modern equivalents. Chinese teams are using artificial intelligence to decode incomplete traditional medicine formulas. Ancient texts often list most ingredients, but omit 1 or 2, either because the scribe assumed readers knew them or because the information was deliberately withheld. AI systems trained on thousands of complete traditional formulas can predict missing ingredients based on the listed components and the condition being treated. When researchers test these AI-completed recipes, many work as effectively as complete formulas. Indian institutes are studying Ayurvedic metallic preparations using modern toxicology. Ancient texts describe processing toxic heavy metals, mercury, lead, arsenic, through elaborate purification procedures involving specific herbs and heating cycles. Western medicine dismissed these as dangerous quackery, but modern analysis shows the processing techniques actually transform the metals into different compounds with dramatically reduced toxicity and legitimate therapeutic properties. The ancient procedures weren't superstition. They were sophisticated metallurgical chemistry. The challenges are significant. Ancient measurements weren't standardized. A handful varies. A cupful depends on cup size. Plant species have evolved over millennia, potentially changing their chemical composition. Some ingredients mentioned in texts are extinct or unidentifiable. We simply don't know what plant or mineral the ancient name referred to. Yet despite these obstacles, enough recreated remedies work to suggest that ancient physicians knew exactly what they were doing. The formulas weren't lucky guesses. They were refined protocols developed through centuries of experimentation. This research requires humility. The default assumption for most of modern history was that ancient medicine was primitive, that we obviously know better now. The reverse engineering projects are showing that assumption was arrogant. Ancient physicians working with limited technology but unlimited time created treatments that modern medicine, with all its resources, hadn't thought to try. Scientists recreated a 1,000-year-old recipe, and it killed bacteria that modern antibiotics can touch. That sentence should be impossible, but it is true. We refinding ancient cures, validating ancient wisdom, recreating lost formulas. But the biggest question remains: how much more is out there? In the basement of the British Museum, approximately 40,000 clay tablets sit in storage. They've been catalogued, numbered, photographed, but most haven't been translated. The museum employs a handful of cuneiformists, scholars who can read ancient Mesopotamian script. At their current pace, it would take several lifetimes to translate everything in storage. Some of those tablets are medical texts. We know because a few have been randomly translated and turned out to contain prescriptions, surgical protocols, pharmaceutical formulas. How many more medical tablets are there? What do they say? What lost treatments are sitting in a storage box catalogued as administrative tablet because nobody has read them yet? This isn't unique to the British Museum. The Louvre has untranslated tablets. The Iraq Museum, despite looting and war, still houses texts that haven't been studied. Universities across Europe and America have collections acquired a century ago that remain largely unexamined. Thousands of ancient medical texts exist, photographed, preserved, waiting for someone to translate them. Egypt's tombs continue yielding secrets. Ground-penetrating radar has detected chambers that haven't been opened in 3,000 years. Some are in places we've already excavated, hidden rooms behind known walls, burial shafts beneath explored areas. They're sealed, which means whatever's inside is protected from decay. If any of these chambers contain medical papyri, they could be intact, complete, offering knowledge that partial documents can't provide. China's imperial archives are vast. During dynastic transitions, records were moved, buried, or hidden to protect them from destruction. Modern construction projects occasionally uncover buried libraries, rooms filled with manuscripts that were sealed and forgotten centuries ago. Many haven't been catalogued, let alone translated. What medical knowledge sits in those collections? Central and South America still hide cities beneath jungle canopy. LiDAR technology, laser mapping from aircraft, is revealing Mayan and Incan sites that haven't been excavated. Some will contain medical texts. The few codices that survived Spanish destruction proved that pre-Columbian civilizations had sophisticated botanical and medical knowledge. What is buried in unexcavated sites? Monastic libraries in Ethiopia, Armenia, and Central Asia contain manuscripts that have never been digitized or studied by modern scholars. Some monasteries are inaccessible, remote, or protective of their collections. What medical texts exist in those libraries? What unique knowledge did isolated Christian communities preserve that the rest of the world lost? Genomic archaeology is opening new possibilities. By analyzing ancient human remains, researchers can identify what diseases people suffered from and potentially what treatments worked. If bone tissue shows someone survived a condition that should have been fatal, that suggests effective treatment. If populations show evidence of diseases that suddenly decreased in frequency, that might indicate successful medical intervention. The clues are in the bones, waiting for technology sensitive enough to read them. Living repositories of medical knowledge are dying faster than museums can document them. Indigenous languages disappear every few weeks. When a language dies, the knowledge encoded in it often dies too. Plant names, preparation methods, treatment protocols that exist only in oral tradition. Ethnobotanists estimate that hundreds, perhaps thousands of medicinal plants used by indigenous healers remain unknown to science. There is a race happening right now, researchers documenting traditional knowledge before the last elders pass away. Linguists recording languages before their final speakers die. Botanists cataloguing plants before deforestation eliminates them. The knowledge exists today. It might not exist tomorrow. Coordinated digitization projects are attempting to create searchable databases of ancient medical texts. Researchers can query these databases for specific symptoms, ingredients, or conditions, essentially data mining 5,000 years of human medical observation. Early results are promising. Searches for treatments of specific ailments are turning up formulas that nobody had noticed before, hidden in texts that scholars read but didn't recognize as medically significant. Climate change threatens archaeological sites. Rising seas, increased rainfall causing decay. Desert sites that remained preserved for millennia are now being damaged by changing weather patterns. Every year we delay exploration is a year more knowledge might be lost. Right now, in museum basements and remote villages, undiscovered cures for modern diseases sit waiting. The knowledge exists. The question is whether we'll reach it in time, whether we'll fund the translations, support the excavations, document the living traditions before they disappear forever. The knowledge exists. The question is whether we'll find it, study it, and apply it. But even as we search for lost cures, we face a deeper question. The child arrived at the emergency room barely breathing. Severe bacterial pneumonia. The doctors administered broad-spectrum antibiotics through IV, oxygen support, careful monitoring. Modern medicine, at its best, decisive intervention that saved a life within hours. No ancient remedy could have worked that fast. No herbal preparation would have cleared that infection before it killed. This is what modern medicine does brilliantly: emergency intervention, acute crisis management, surgical repair, diagnostic precision. These capabilities save millions of lives. Rejecting them would be foolish, even dangerous. But 3 months later, the same child developed chronic digestive problems. Antibiotics had eliminated beneficial gut bacteria along with the infection. The pediatrician prescribed probiotics and dietary changes, essentially recommending fermented foods and plant-based protocols that ancient medicine had used for thousands of years. The combination healed what medicine alone had disrupted. The future of medicine isn't choosing between ancient and modern. It is having the wisdom to use both. Integration is already happening in hospitals worldwide. Oncology centers offer acupuncture for chemotherapy, induced nausea. Pain clinics combine conventional medications with meditation and Tai Chi. Surgical units apply medical-grade honey to wounds, an ancient Egyptian practice validated by modern research showing it outperforms some antibiotic ointments. Family doctors prescribe dietary changes based on principles ancient physicians established millennia ago. These aren't fringe practices anymore. They're evidence-based protocols, appearing in mainstream medical settings because they work. Patients receiving integrated care often show better outcomes than those receiving conventional treatment alone. Not because ancient medicine is superior, but because it addresses aspects of healing that modern medicine overlooks. The challenges to integration are real. Regulatory systems don't know how to classify traditional medicines. They're not drugs in the conventional sense, so approval pathways are unclear. Many doctors resist traditional practices because they weren't trained in them, and skepticism is professionally easier than learning new systems. Insurance rarely covers traditional treatments, making them economically inaccessible for many patients. Medical schools teach minimal content about traditional medicine, graduating doctors who know antibiotics, but not acupuncture points, surgery, but not herbal interactions. Yet success models exist. Integrative oncology programs at major cancer centers combine chemotherapy with traditional herbs that reduce side effects and support immune function. Pain management clinics using both medication and acupuncture help patients reduce opioid dependence while maintaining quality of life. Some medical schools now offer elective courses in traditional medicine, training doctors who respect multiple healing traditions. The principle is pragmatism over ideology. Use what works regardless of its origin. If an ancient remedy performs better than a modern drug for a specific condition, use it. If modern diagnostic imaging reveals what ancient pulse diagnosis cannot, use it. Medicine shouldn't be tribal. It should be effective. Modern science provides the framework for rigorous testing. Ancient medicine provides thousands of years of clinical observation and hypotheses worth investigating. Together, they create possibilities neither offers alone. Ancient wisdom without modern validation risks harm from ineffective or dangerous treatments. Modern medicine without ancient insight misses opportunities to heal more completely and prevent disease before it starts. Patient empowerment matters here. Informed patients can advocate for integrative approaches. They can seek practitioners who respect both conventional and traditional medicine. They can make healthcare choices that align with their values while staying grounded in evidence. The best patients aren't passive recipients of either system, they're active participants using both. This doesn't mean every ancient remedy works. It doesn't mean modern medicine is wrong. It means both have value, both have limitations, and both, used together with wisdom and discernment, serve human health better than either alone. The doctor who dismisses traditional medicine completely is missing tools that could help patients. The alternative practitioner who rejects conventional medicine completely is abandoning life-saving interventions. The patient who believes only one system has merit is limiting their own healing possibilities. Integration requires humility from all sides. Modern doctors must acknowledge that thousand-year-old treatments sometimes work better than newly developed drugs. Traditional practitioners must recognize that MRI scans reveal what pulse diagnosis cannot. Patients must become educated enough to evaluate both systems critically. The path forward isn't rejection, it is integration. Ancient wisdom informing modern practice. Modern precision validating ancient observation. Traditional knowledge preventing disease. Conventional medicine treating acute crisis. Both working together for human health. Integration is the path, but it requires something from all of us. Researchers willing to study ancient texts, doctors willing to learn from other traditions, patients willing to explore beyond conventional options, and societies willing to protect the knowledge that remains. The question is, are we ready? We've lost ancient medical knowledge before, not once, twice, 3 times. Throughout history, Alexandria burned, the healers were killed, the libraries crumbled. Centuries of accumulated wisdom vanished in fire, persecution, and neglect. Medieval Europe forgot what Rome had known. The Renaissance had to rediscover what Greece had documented. We're now validating what ancient civilizations practiced successfully for millennia. The pattern is clear. Human knowledge isn't cumulative by default. It doesn't automatically pass forward through time. It survives only when people choose to preserve it. When societies value it, when institutions protect it, when individuals remember. We're recovering lost knowledge now, translating ancient texts, validating traditional remedies, recreating forgotten formulas. But there is no guarantee we won't lose it again. Modern threats are different but equally real. Cultural homogenization erases indigenous practices as younger generations abandon traditional ways. Rainforest destruction eliminates medicinal plants before they're studied. Species going extinct that could have treated diseases we can't cure. Pharmaceutical patent systems discourage research into natural medicines that can't be profitably monopolized. Healthcare consolidation standardizes treatment protocols, leaving no room for traditional approaches that don't fit corporate medical models. This isn't inevitable, it is a choice. And every person watching this can influence the outcome. Support indigenous rights. Traditional knowledge holders need legal protection and fair compensation when their wisdom becomes commercial products. Fund archaeological research. The texts exist. The sites await excavation. The translations require resources. Choose integrative healthcare when possible. Seek practitioners who respect both conventional and traditional medicine. Learn about medicinal plants. even basic knowledge, which herbs help, which conditions, preserves wisdom that might otherwise disappear. Document family healing knowledge. That remedy your grandmother used might contain insights worth preserving. Advocate for traditional medicine education. Medical schools should teach future doctors about healing systems that have worked for thousands of years, not just pharmaceuticals developed in the last century. Ancient medicine's story teaches a crucial lesson: humility. What we know isn't all there is to know. What is new isn't always better. What is forgotten isn't necessarily obsolete. Every age believes it has reached the peak of knowledge. Every age is wrong. We're not at the summit of medical understanding. We're somewhere on the slope, climbing toward truths that earlier civilizations glimpsed and we're rediscovering. Imagine a medical system that combines high-tech diagnostics with ancient herbal wisdom, emergency surgery with holistic prevention, pharmaceutical precision with traditional plant medicine, specialized doctors with generalist healers who treat whole persons, not isolated symptoms. Treatment protocols supported by community care instead of isolated recovery. This isn't fantasy. Elements exist today, they're just not coordinated, not integrated, not recognized as equally valid parts of a complete medical system. Ancient healing isn't about returning to the past. It is about carrying wisdom forward, taking the best of what ancient civilizations discovered and combining it with the best of what modern science has achieved. Not rejecting progress, but enriching it with patience, observation, and respect for knowledge accumulated over millennia. The lost cures of ancient civilizations could change medicine forever, but only if we choose to remember, choose to study, choose to validate. We've lost this knowledge twice in history. The question facing us now, facing every person who has watched this documentary, is simple but profound. Will we lose it again, or will we finally learn from the past? What ancient knowledge are we still missing? What could we discover tomorrow that changes everything? What wisdom sits waiting in an untranslated text, an undocumented tradition, an unexplored plant? The story isn't finished. We're living the next chapter. And what happens next, whether we remember or forget, is up to all of us.